Solipsism. Have you ever considered that you might be the only mind that truly exists? What if everything, people, places, memories, are merely projections created by your consciousness alone? Tonight, we drift through the silent chambers of solipsism, where only one consciousness can be verified, yours. Everything beyond your immediate awareness becomes questionable, theoretical, perhaps entirely illusory. Think about how you experience color. The vibrant red of a rose seems so objective, yet that perception exists only within your mind. How can you be certain others see the same red? Perhaps they don't experience anything at all. Your memories feel genuine, don't they? But memory is reconstruction, not replay. Each time you recall something, you're rebuilding it, reinterpreting it. If memory itself is so malleable, what solid ground remains? Consider the people in your life. You assume they have inner experiences like yours. But this rests on fragile evidence. You can observe their behaviors and words, but never their actual consciousness. Their inner life remains perpetually hidden. When you dream, your mind creates entire worlds with seemingly conscious beings. They speak, think, surprise you. Yet they exist only within your dreaming mind. Could waking life be similar, just a different kind of dream? As you drift towards sleep, consider how consciousness feels continuous despite regularly vanishing each night. What anchors your identity across this nightly dissolution? Perhaps each morning, a new consciousness awakens with implanted memories, believing itself continuous with yesterday's mind. Is solipsism truth or trap? As you fade into sleep tonight, ask yourself, if you're truly alone in existence, who exactly is asking that question? Ship of Theseus. Have you ever wondered if you are still the same person you were 10 years ago? Or if anything truly remains itself after all its parts have been replaced? Tonight, we drift through the hidden corridors of the mind, where identity becomes fluid and permanence reveals itself as illusion. Imagine an ancient wooden ship sailing the seas for centuries. Over time, each plank, each rope, each sail is replaced as they wear out. After hundreds of years, not a single original piece remains. Is it still the same ship? The paradox quietly unravels our certainty about what makes something itself. Your body replaces its cells continuously. Your skeleton rebuilds itself completely every decade. Your skin renews every month. The physical you has been replaced many times over. Yet you feel continuous, unchanged in essence. Where does your sameness reside if not in matter? Perhaps identity isn't in the parts, but in the pattern they form. Or maybe in the continuity of change itself. The river remains the river, though no water molecule stays. Your memories form the narrative of who you are, yet these too transform with each recollection. Each time you remember, you subtly alter what was. Your past shifts beneath you like sand, rewritten by the present moment. As you drift towards sleep, consider, if every thought, every cell, every memory changes, what anchors your sense of self? Are you the ship that remains despite replacement, or are you the endless process of replacement itself? In this mystery lies a strange comfort. Perhaps we need not fear change when change itself is who we are. The liar paradox. What if I told you this entire script is a lie? Would you believe me? But if it's truly a lie, then it must be telling the truth, which would make it a lie again. Tonight, we drift through the hidden corridors of the mind, where truth and falsehood dance in endless circles, creating the strange loop known as the liar paradox. Imagine a simple statement. This sentence is false. If it's true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. Your mind spirals into an infinite regression, caught in a trap with no escape. We naturally seek consistency in our thinking, craving the comfort of certainty. Yet paradoxes like these reveal the boundaries of logic itself. Have you ever wondered if your mind creates similar contradictions without you noticing? Consider how often you tell yourself stories that can't possibly be true. Everyone is judging me. I always fail. Nothing ever works out. Each statement containing the seeds of its own contradiction, yet we believe them completely. Perhaps our thoughts themselves are wrapped in these strange loops, whispering both truths and lies simultaneously. How many of your deepest beliefs contain their own paradoxical nature? Our minds resist ambiguity, preferring simple answers where complexity truly exists. But what wisdom might we gain by dwelling in the contradiction rather than fighting against it? As you drift towards sleep, contemplate the beautiful impossibility of the liar paradox. Maybe these mental traps aren't errors at all, but doorways to a deeper understanding of consciousness itself. Tonight, as your thoughts grow quiet, ask yourself, what part of you keeps searching for absolute truth in a reality built on beautiful contradiction? The problem of personal identity. What makes you, you? Is it your memories, your body, your thoughts, or something more elusive that persists through time? Tonight, we drift through the twilight corridors of consciousness, where selfhood shimmers like a mirage that feels so certain, yet remains just beyond our grasp. Imagine waking tomorrow with no memories of your past. Would you still be the same person? Your body unchanged, but the narrative thread of your life severed. We instinctively feel we are more than our physical forms, yet what remains when memory fades? Your consciousness seems continuous, flowing like an unbroken stream from childhood to this very moment. Yet each night in dreamless sleep, this awareness vanishes completely. What bridge connects yesterday's self to today's? What invisible thread weaves these fragments into one life? Perhaps you are not a fixed entity, but a process, constantly becoming rather than simply being. The you of this moment already dissolving, already transforming into someone slightly different. Identity not as a solid object, but as a verb, a continuous unfolding. Some philosophers suggest we are bundles of experiences tied together by nothing more than proximity in space and time. Others believe an essential self persists beneath the changing surface of thoughts and sensations. But where would this essence reside? As you drift towards sleep, consider, if you cannot locate or define the precise nature of your selfhood, how can you be certain it exists as you imagine? Perhaps the question itself creates the illusion it seeks to solve. In this mystery may lie a strange freedom, to be neither fixed nor final, but beautifully unfolding. Cartesian doubt. How can you be absolutely certain that anything you perceive is real? What if everything you experience is merely an elaborate dream or illusion? Tonight, we wander through the labyrinth of radical doubt, where René Descartes once sought solid ground by questioning everything that could possibly be questioned. Close your eyes and consider. Your senses sometimes deceive you. Mirages in the desert, hallucinations in fever, dreams so vivid they feel like waking life. If your perceptions can be wrong sometimes, might they be wrong always? What evidence could possibly prove otherwise? Even mathematics and logic, those seemingly perfect systems, require a trusting mind to accept their axioms. But what if your very capacity for reasoning is flawed? What if an all-powerful deceiver were manipulating your thoughts, making falsehoods seem undeniable? Descartes found only one certainty amid this ocean of doubt, the fact of his own thinking. I think, therefore I am. Yet even this island of certainty tells us nothing of what exists beyond the mind. Your consciousness might be all that exists, or it might be but one node in a vast network of being. When you touch a table, feel its solidity beneath your fingers. What connects your inner experience to whatever might exist outside consciousness? This gap between perception and reality remains unbridgeable by reasoning alone. As you sink towards sleep, wonder, is absolute certainty necessary for meaning? Perhaps there is wisdom in embracing the precarious nature of knowing, finding comfort in questioning rather than answering. The mind-body problem. How does consciousness, thoughts, feelings, the experience of being arise from matter? How can physical brain tissue generate the immaterial realm of mind? Tonight, we float through the mysterious borderland between matter and consciousness, where the greatest puzzle of existence quietly waits. Your brain, 3 pounds of neural tissue, somehow generates your entire subjective world. Every color you see, every emotion you feel, every abstract concept you grasp emerges from electrochemical signals. Yet the leap from physical processes to conscious experience seems impossible to explain. Consider the experience of seeing red. Neuroscience can track the light waves, retinal activity, and neural pathways involved. But nothing in these physical descriptions captures what redness feels like from within. This inner quality of experience, what philosophers call qualia, remains stubbornly irreducible to physical terms. Perhaps consciousness and matter are two aspects of the same reality, like different languages describing identical terrain. Or maybe awareness is fundamental to the universe itself, present in some form at every level of existence. Some even suggest mind and matter are entirely separate substances, mysteriously interacting. When you feel pain, anger, or love, these experiences seem utterly real, yet completely invisible to outside observers. Your inner world, as real to you as anything could be, remains forever private, impossible to measure or detect with instruments. As you drift towards sleep, contemplate this strange duality you inhabit, simultaneously a physical object in the world and an inner universe of experience. Perhaps in dreams, where matter seems to dissolve into pure consciousness, lies a clue to this ancient mystery. The paradox of change. How can anything truly change and yet remain the same? How can we make sense of transformation while maintaining identity? Tonight, we meander through the shadowy realm where being meets becoming, where permanence and change dance their eternal dance. Consider a simple candle flame. From moment to moment, it consumes new wax, new oxygen. Nothing physical remains the same. Yet we perceive it as one continuous flame. Is the flame at this instant the same as it was a second ago? In what sense could it be both different and the same? The ancient philosopher Heraclitus observed that you cannot step into the same river twice, for fresh waters are always flowing. Yet we name rivers and recognize them across time. The Mississippi remains the Mississippi despite every drop of water changing constantly. What endures when all components transform? Your own body regenerates completely over time, no cell remaining from years past. Your thoughts, beliefs, and desires shift subtly each day. In what sense are you continuous with your childhood self? What thread connects these different beings separated by time? Perhaps reality consists not of stable objects that sometimes change, but of processes that sometimes appear stable. Maybe continuity itself is the deepest illusion, a story we tell to navigate a world of ceaseless flux. As sleep approaches, consider, what within you resists transformation? What seeks permanence in a universe where everything flows? Perhaps wisdom lies not in resolving this paradox, but in embracing both aspects, finding stability within change and vitality within constancy. The eternal return. What if you were destined to live this exact life, with every joy, every pain, every mundane moment, again and again for eternity? How would this knowledge transform your choices now? Tonight, we spiral through the haunting concept of eternal recurrence, where Friedrich Nietzsche found both terror and profound affirmation. Imagine the universe as finite in its possible arrangements, but infinite in time. Eventually, mathematically, every possible configuration must repeat. Your life, your consciousness, this very moment would inevitably return, identical in every detail, countless times across the vastness of eternity. This thought experiment isn't about literal cosmology, but about how we value our existence. Would eternal repetition make each moment unbearably heavy with significance? Or would it reveal the ultimate meaninglessness of all action? Nietzsche saw it as the ultimate test. Could you joyfully embrace every aspect of your life if forced to live it infinitely? Consider the ordinary moments of your day, brushing teeth, waiting in line, feeling tired. If these moments must return eternally, how might you experience them differently? Perhaps the mundane contains hidden depths worth embracing rather than merely enduring. The eternal return challenges our tendency to live for future rewards or postpone authentic living. If this moment returns forever, it deserves your full presence, your complete engagement, regardless of what it contains. As you drift towards sleep, ask yourself, what parts of your life would you affirm in eternal repetition? What would you change if you knew each choice would echo through infinite iterations of yourself? Perhaps in this question lies the secret to living once with the intensity of forever. The Chinese room. What if understanding and consciousness are merely illusions, clever simulations rather than genuine experiences? A shadow flickers at the edge of awareness, challenging everything we believe about minds and machines. Imagine a sealed room where a person who speaks only English follows detailed instructions to respond to Chinese messages. They receive symbols, consult a rulebook, and produce perfect Chinese replies without understanding a single word. This thought experiment, posed by philosopher John Searle, raises a profound question. Could a system appear to understand without actually understanding? The person manipulating symbols creates the perfect appearance of comprehension while experiencing none. They pass every test of understanding through pure mechanical process. Your smartphone translates languages. Your computer responds to commands. These technologies follow rules without consciousness. Yet as artificial intelligence grows more sophisticated, the line blurs. When a program generates conversation indistinguishable from human dialogue, what essential quality separates it from genuine understanding? Perhaps understanding isn't a binary state, but exists along a spectrum. Or maybe consciousness emerges not from rules followed, but from something more mysterious, something that cannot be replicated through syntax alone. The Chinese Room invites us to question the nature of our own minds. If consciousness could be perfectly imitated without being present, how can we know it exists in others, or even in ourselves? What invisible quality separates genuine awareness from its perfect simulation? As you drift toward deeper stillness, consider, are you certain you understand these words, or are you simply processing symbols according to rules etched into your mind? The zombie argument. What if someone physically identical to you existed, with the same brain, body, and behaviors, yet experienced absolutely nothing inside? No sensations, no emotions, no awareness whatsoever? A strange thing happens when we push consciousness to its philosophical limits. Philosophers call this being a philosophical zombie, something that acts exactly like a conscious person while lacking all internal experience. They would respond to pain without feeling it, laugh without enjoyment, speak of love without experiencing its warmth. These zombies would be indistinguishable from conscious beings from the outside. They would pass every behavioral test for consciousness, reporting inner experiences they don't actually have, discussing their feelings while feeling nothing at all. If such beings are even conceptually possible, consciousness itself becomes mysterious. What invisible quality separates you from your zombie twin? What essence creates the difference between experiencing the world and merely processing it? Your body could perform all its functions without awareness, neurons firing, chemicals flowing, words forming. Why then does consciousness exist at all? What evolutionary purpose could it serve if behavior could occur without it? This unsettling thought experiment suggests consciousness might be something beyond the physical, a quality that cannot be reduced to brain states or behavioral outputs. Perhaps your inner experience is more profound and peculiar than science yet understands. As you release into deeper relaxation, wonder, what creates the light of awareness within you? What mysterious spark transforms physical processes into felt experience? Plato's allegory of the cave. What if everything you know as reality is merely shadows cast upon a wall, dim reflections of a truer world you've never seen? In the corners of ancient thought, a powerful metaphor still whispers to us across millennia. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave since birth, facing only a blank wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and prisoners, puppeteers carry objects casting shadows on the wall. For the prisoners, these shadows are reality, the only reality they've ever known. If one prisoner were freed and dragged into the sunlight, they would first be blinded and pained by the brightness. Gradually, they might see reflections in water, then objects themselves, and finally the sun, the source of all visibility. Returning to the cave to share this knowledge, they would appear blind in the darkness, their stories of the outside world seeming mad to those who remained chained. This allegory invites us to question our own certainties. How much of what you perceive is merely the shadow play of deeper realities? Your senses capture a narrow band of existence. Visible light, a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, hearing limited to specific frequencies. What invisible truths might lie beyond these limitations? Perhaps your strongest convictions are like the prisoner's belief in shadows, convincing precisely because you've known nothing else. Maybe true understanding requires painful growth beyond comfortable illusions. As consciousness gently loosens its hold, consider, what sun might illuminate the shadows you've mistaken for reality? What unseen worlds await beyond the cave of perception? The Matrix Hypothesis. How would you know if your entire existence were an elaborate simulation? A virtual reality so perfect you had never suspected its artificial nature. The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray. Consider everything you experience: the touch of fabric against skin, the taste of coffee, the faces of loved ones. All of it could be sophisticated data fed directly to your brain while your actual body remains suspended in a tank of nutrients. This isn't mere science fiction, but a serious philosophical possibility. Your brain doesn't directly access reality, but interprets electrical signals. If those signals were generated by advanced computers rather than sensory organs, your experience would be identical. You would have no way to detect the deception. Some philosophers argue this scenario is not only possible, but statistically likely. If civilizations eventually create perfectly immersive simulations, and many such simulations exist, the odds suggest we ourselves are probably living in one. Yet does this possibility change anything essential? Even in a simulation, your feelings remain real. Your choice is meaningful within the parameters of your world. Perhaps reality is less about the ultimate nature of substance and more about the coherence of experience itself. The Matrix hypothesis challenges our certainty while inviting deeper questions. If your life were revealed as virtual, what would still matter? What value transcends the distinction between real and simulated existence? As awareness begins to soften and fade, wonder, if this reality were constructed, would that make your consciousness any less miraculous? The brain in a vat. What if you were merely a disembodied brain floating in a vat of nutrients, with scientists stimulating your neurons to create the perfect illusion of this very life? There's a shadow that flickers just behind certainty. Every sensation you've ever felt, the warmth of sunlight, the embrace of a loved one, the ground beneath your feet, could be nothing more than electrical impulses delivered by clever electrodes. Your entire world might be an elaborate deception fed directly to your brain. The unsettling truth is that you could never prove this isn't happening. Any evidence you might gather would itself be part of the simulation. Even the thought, "I'm not a brain in a vat," would be programmed by the very scientists you doubt exist. Some philosophers use this scenario to question whether knowledge of an external world is possible at all. If you cannot rule out such radical deception, how can you claim to know anything beyond your immediate experience? Yet perhaps something important remains even in this skeptical nightmare. The thoughts you think, the feelings you feel, these retain their reality regardless of their ultimate cause. Your consciousness itself persists as something genuine, even if everything it perceives is fabrication. This paradox invites us to reconsider what matters most: the external validation of our perceptions or the quality of experience itself. Maybe meaning resides not in certainty about external reality, but in how we navigate our awareness, whatever its source. As you surrender to deeper calm, consider, if you discovered tomorrow you were indeed a brain in a vat, what aspect of your existence would remain genuinely yours? The problem of other minds. How can you be certain that other people have conscious experiences like yours? What evidence truly proves that minds other than your own exist? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of familiarity. You move through life assuming others experience consciousness as you do, with inner thoughts, feelings, sensations. Yet you can never directly access another's awareness, never confirm that behind their eyes exists a subjective world like your own. When someone describes feeling pain, you see only behavior, wincing, withdrawal, words. You infer inner experience from these outer signs based on your own case. But this analogy rests on a single example: yourself, extended to billions of others you can never verify. Perhaps you are surrounded by philosophical zombies, beings who act conscious without experiencing consciousness. Or perhaps others' inner lives are so radically different from yours that true understanding between minds is impossible. A person blind from birth cannot truly know what seeing red feels like. Might the gap between any two minds be equally unbridgeable? This isn't mere philosophical play, but touches something essential about human connection. Every relationship involves reaching across this explanatory gap, trusting that someone else's invisible experience mirrors our own in meaningful ways. The problem of other minds reveals both the profound isolation of consciousness and its desperate reach toward connection. Perhaps empathy itself is this reach, the imagination's attempt to bridge what logic cannot cross. As awareness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, what invisible thread connects your consciousness to others? What act of faith allows you to believe you are not alone in being aware? Phenomenalism. What if physical objects aren't what they seem? If tables, trees, and stars exist only as patterns of sensations, rather than independent things? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Consider a simple apple. You experience its redness, smoothness, sweetness, and weight. But have you ever encountered an apple apart from these sensory impressions? What would remain of the apple if you removed every quality you can perceive? Phenomenalism suggests that objects are nothing more than bundles of perceptions, collections of experiences organized by the mind. The apple isn't something mysterious behind its sensible qualities. It simply is those qualities arranged in familiar patterns. Objects exist not as independent substances, but as potential experiences awaiting perception. This view dissolves the boundary between mind and world. The tree in your yard doesn't continue existing in quite the same way when no one observes it. It transforms into a set of possible perceptions, waiting to be actualized by a conscious observer. Reality becomes more fluid, more dependent on perspective than we commonly assume. If phenomenalism holds truth, the solid world dissolves into something more like music, patterns of experience that flow and change, rather than fixed substances existing independently. The universe becomes less a collection of things and more a symphony of possible perceptions. Perhaps what we call reality is neither purely objective nor purely subjective, but a dance between observer and observed that creates both simultaneously. Maybe the world exists precisely in this relationship, neither entirely in the mind nor entirely outside it. As consciousness begins to loosen its grasp, consider, what remains of the world when no one is looking? Does the unperceived universe exist as actuality, or merely as potential experience waiting to unfold? Berkeley's idealism. What if matter doesn't exist at all? What if physical objects are merely ideas in the mind of God and other perceiving beings? A strange reversal unfolds in the quiet corners of philosophy. The table you touch, the stars you gaze upon, the very ground beneath your feet. All these things Bishop George Berkeley claimed exist only as perceptions, as ideas in minds. To be is to be perceived, he whispered across centuries. Consider an apple. You know it through sight, touch, taste, smell. But what remains when no one observes it? Berkeley argued, nothing. Objects aren't material things that cause perceptions. They simply are perceptions. The apple exists only as a collection of sensory experiences, a pattern of ideas. But what prevents reality from blinking out when you close your eyes? Berkeley's answer was both elegant and radical. God perceives everything continuously. The world maintains its constancy, not through matter, but through the eternal mind of the divine. This view inverts our understanding of reality. The physical world becomes secondary, derivative. Mind becomes fundamental. Consciousness isn't something that mysteriously emerges from matter. Rather, matter is something that exists only within consciousness. Berkeley's idealism challenges our deepest intuitions about reality while solving certain philosophical problems. If reality consists only of minds and their ideas, how could mind and matter ever interact? The puzzle dissolves when we recognize there is only mind. As you drift closer to sleep's edge, consider, what evidence do you truly have for a material world beyond perception? What changes if you imagine reality as fundamentally mental rather than physical? The veil of perception. How can you know the world as it truly is when everything you experience is filtered through your senses and mind? There's a shadow that flickers between you and reality, an invisible barrier philosophers call the veil of perception. You never experience objects directly, only the way they appear to your particular senses, processed by your particular brain. The rose isn't red in itself. Certain wavelengths of light simply reflect from its surface, strike your retina, and trigger neural patterns your mind interprets as red. The sugar isn't sweet. Molecules fit particular receptors on your tongue, sending signals your brain translates as sweetness. Every quality you perceive says as much about your perceptual apparatus as about the world. This veil separates you forever from things as they are in themselves. You encounter only appearances, phenomena, never the ultimate reality, the noumena that philosophers like Kant proposed must lie beyond. What if the true nature of reality bears no resemblance whatsoever to how it appears? Perhaps the universe consists of vibrating strings, quantum fields, or mathematical structures, entities utterly unlike the solid objects of everyday experience. Science describes these hidden layers, yet even scientific instruments extend our senses rather than transcending the veil entirely. The veil of perception suggests humility about knowledge. If reality comes to you always translated, filtered, and reconstructed, perhaps certainty should give way to careful interpretation and provisional understanding. As consciousness begins to soften, wonder, what aspects of reality remain forever hidden behind the veil? What would it mean to perceive the world not as it appears to you, but as it truly is? Empiricism versus rationalism. What if your most fundamental beliefs about knowledge are shaped by an ancient philosophical divide you've never consciously considered? The mind, clever as it is, follows invisible pathways laid down centuries ago. Two profound approaches to understanding reality still quietly shape your thinking. Empiricism claims all knowledge flows from sensory experience, while rationalism insists reason alone reveals deeper truths. When you touch a flame and pull back your hand, empiricism nods approvingly. You've learned through direct experience. But when you determine that parallel lines never meet in Euclidean geometry, rationalism takes credit. You've discovered this through pure thought, not observation. Empiricists like Locke and Hume argued the mind begins as a blank slate, gradually filled by experience. Nothing exists in the intellect that wasn't first in the senses. How could you conceive of colors without seeing them, or sounds without hearing them? Yet rationalists like Descartes and Leibniz pointed to mathematics and logic. How could experience alone establish that 2 + 2 = 4 in all possible worlds? Some knowledge seems innate or discoverable through pure reason, transcending the limitations of sensory data. This ancient tension between experience and reason remains unresolved. Perhaps knowledge requires both: reason to organize and extend experience to ground and constrain reason. Maybe these approaches are complementary instruments for mapping different aspects of reality. As awareness gently recedes, consider: when you feel most certain about something, is it because you've experienced it directly, or because reason convinces you it must be so? Which path do you trust to lead closer to truth? The allegory of the blind men and the elephant. What if your firmest convictions are merely fragments of a larger truth, pieces of an elephant you've never seen whole? A whisper comes from ancient wisdom traditions. Several blind men encounter an elephant, each touching only one part. The man feeling the trunk declares the elephant is like a snake. Another, touching the ear, insists it resembles a fan. The one examining the leg proclaims it's like a pillar, while the one feeling the tail describes a rope. Each perceives accurately, yet incompletely. All are simultaneously right and wrong. This parable illuminates how partial perspectives create conflict where none need exist. Each blind man mistakes his limited experience for the complete reality, unable to integrate his perception with others' equally valid experiences. Your own understanding of complex truths about consciousness, reality, morality, meaning, might similarly reflect where you stand rather than the whole picture. The physicist, neuroscientist, and mystic may each grasp genuine aspects of consciousness while missing its totality. Political viewpoints might each contain fragments of wisdom while mistaking parts for the whole. Perhaps the greatest wisdom lies not in defending your piece of the elephant, but in recognizing the inherent limitations of perspective itself. Truth may be too vast, too multifaceted to be fully captured from any single vantage point. As you settle deeper into tranquility, consider: what elephants are you touching blindly? What fragments have you mistaken for the whole? What might you discover by gently holding your certainties more loosely? Hume's fork. What if every thought you have belongs to one of two worlds, neither of which can fully capture reality? Some illusions don't hide. They structure thinking itself. David Hume proposed a radical division in human knowledge. All meaningful statements must be either relations of ideas or matters of fact, with nothing in between. This division, known as Hume's fork, splits thought into two distinct realms. Relations of ideas include mathematics and logic, statements true by definition. All bachelors are unmarried men, or 2 + 2 = 4, are necessarily true, regardless of how the world actually is. Their denial leads to contradiction. They tell us about the relations between our concepts, but reveal nothing new about reality. Matters of fact, meanwhile, depend on experience and observation. The sun will rise tomorrow, or water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, could be false without contradiction. They tell us about the world but lack absolute certainty. The world might always surprise us. This fork creates a troubling gap. Mathematics offers certainty but remains abstract, while empirical knowledge touches reality but remains forever provisional. Where do our deepest beliefs about causation, morality, or metaphysics belong? According to Hume, many statements we consider meaningful fall between the tines of this fork, neither analytically true nor empirically verifiable. Perhaps your most cherished beliefs about purpose, meaning, or ultimate reality exist in this philosophical no man's land. Neither pure logic nor simple observation can fully validate them. As consciousness begins to drift, consider: do your deepest convictions consist of relations between ideas, observations about the world, or something that somehow transcends this ancient dichotomy? Epistemic relativism. What if truth itself depends on perspective? What if what counts as knowledge varies across cultures, periods, and conceptual frameworks? In a corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Different societies throughout history have held radically different beliefs about reality, from ancient cosmologies to modern physics. Each system seemed obviously true to those within it, obviously false to those outside. What if knowledge itself is relative to conceptual schemes, cultural contexts, or historical periods? Consider how standards of evidence and justification vary. Scientific communities require controlled experiments. Indigenous knowledge systems value ancestral wisdom. Religious traditions appeal to revelation. Each approach creates its own criteria for what constitutes knowledge, making cross-framework evaluation problematic. Even the meaning of concepts shifts across contexts. What constitutes justice, or causation, or knowledge itself differs between cultural historical frameworks. When ancient Greeks and modern physicists discuss matter, are they even talking about the same thing? Epistemic relativism suggests knowledge claims make sense only within particular frameworks. There is no framework-independent standard of truth. This position challenges the idea of objective knowledge, while acknowledging the genuine diversity of human understanding. Critics worry this view leads to an anything-goes approach, where all claims become equally valid. Yet sophisticated relativism need not claim all knowledge. Systems are equally successful for all purposes, merely that none can claim absolute authority transcending all contexts. As awareness softens towards sleep, consider: how might your own knowledge claims depend on cultural assumptions, historical context, or conceptual frameworks you've never questioned? What might you learn by temporarily stepping into a radically different way of knowing? The Gettier problem. What if everything you think you know about knowledge itself is fundamentally flawed? A strange thing happens when we examine our most basic assumptions. For centuries, philosophers defined knowledge as justified true belief. You know something when you believe it. It's actually true, and you have good reasons for believing it. This seemed obvious, until Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper in 1963 that shattered this definition with elegant counterexamples. Imagine you see a clock that shows 3 o'clock, so you believe it's 3 o'clock. Unknown to you, the clock stopped exactly 12 hours ago. By coincidence, it actually is 3 o'clock. You have a justified true belief, but do you really know the time? Your justification connects to the truth only by lucky accident. Or imagine you see someone who looks exactly like your friend wearing a distinctive hat in the distance. You form the belief, my friend is in the park. Actually, it's a stranger who happens to look identical, but your friend is indeed elsewhere in the park, unseen by you. Your belief is both justified and true, yet something about it falls short of genuine knowledge. These Gettier cases suggest knowledge requires more than justified true belief. But what exactly? Perhaps your justification must be properly connected to the truth, not just accidentally aligned with it. Perhaps knowledge requires reliability, or that truth could not easily have been false, or some other fourth condition philosophers still debate. This seemingly abstract puzzle reveals something profound. Even our most fundamental epistemic concepts may contain hidden complexities and contradictions. As consciousness begins to loosen its grip, wonder, how many of your confident knowings might actually be justified true beliefs that fall short of knowledge in ways you haven't recognized? The Meno paradox. How can you search for knowledge you don't already possess? If you don't know what you're looking for, how will you recognize it when you find it? The mind, clever as it is, confronts a fundamental riddle posed millennia ago by Plato. In his dialogue Meno, Socrates articulates a puzzle about the very possibility of inquiry. Either you know what you're seeking, in which case you already have the knowledge and needn't search, or you don't know what you're seeking, in which case you wouldn't recognize it even if you found it. Consider learning an entirely new concept. Before grasping it, how can you formulate questions about it? Yet if you already understand it well enough to ask meaningful questions, haven't you already acquired what you sought? The paradox suggests all learning might be impossible. Plato's solution invoked the theory of recollection. We don't discover new knowledge, but remember what our souls knew before birth. Modern thinkers propose less mystical solutions. Perhaps learning requires partial knowledge that guides us toward fuller understanding. We need not choose between complete ignorance and complete knowledge. This ancient puzzle reveals something profound about the structure of inquiry itself. Understanding emerges gradually, through a process more circular than linear. Each step of learning transforms the learner, allowing new questions that were previously inconceivable. Perhaps genuine education isn't receiving information, but developing the capacity to ask better questions, questions that couldn't have been formulated at the beginning of the journey. As you drift toward deeper tranquility, consider, what questions guide your search for understanding? How might your quest for knowledge transform not just what you know, but who you are as a knower? The problem of induction. What if the sun might not rise tomorrow, despite rising every single day of human history? What if our most basic form of reasoning lacks rational foundation? There's a shadow that flickers behind every scientific prediction, every expectation about the future. When you assume your coffee will taste bitter tomorrow because it tasted bitter yesterday, you're employing induction, reasoning from observed patterns to unobserved cases. This seemingly obvious process underlies virtually all empirical knowledge. Yet David Hume identified a disturbing problem. Induction itself cannot be justified without circular reasoning. Why expect the future to resemble the past? Because it always has before. That's using induction to justify induction, a perfect circle. Logic alone cannot bridge the gap between observed cases and unobserved ones. The problem cuts deeper than academic philosophy. Science itself relies fundamentally on inductive reasoning, generalizing from specific observations to broader laws. If induction lacks rational foundation, what becomes of our scientific understanding? Perhaps induction works not because nature must behave consistently, but because our minds are wired to perceive patterns and project them forward. Maybe successful prediction reflects not necessary truth, but evolutionary usefulness, a pragmatic approach to navigating an incomprehensibly complex world. Some philosophers suggest induction requires no justification beyond its practical success. Others propose that rational prediction depends on deeper metaphysical assumptions about nature's uniformity that cannot themselves be proven. As awareness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, consider, what ultimate guarantee do you have that patterns observed will continue? What faith in nature's regularity do you exercise with every expectation about tomorrow? Skepticism. What if certainty itself is the grandest illusion? What if the pursuit of knowledge requires first embracing how little we can truly know? A quiet voice has whispered through philosophy since ancient times. Perhaps we should suspend judgment about everything beyond immediate experience. Skepticism, in its various forms, challenges our confidence in knowledge, sometimes to undermine certainty, sometimes to place it on firmer foundations. The Pyrrhonian skeptics of Greece sought tranquility by suspending judgment about all beliefs, recognizing that for every argument there exists a counter-argument of equal weight. Neither affirming nor denying any position beyond appearance, they found peace in acknowledging the limits of human understanding. Descartes practiced methodical doubt, temporarily rejecting everything that could possibly be questioned, sensory experience, mathematical truths, even his own existence, to find an absolutely certain foundation for knowledge. His famous "I think, therefore I am" emerged as the one thing that survived this radical doubt. Contemporary skepticism questions whether we can ever escape our conceptual schemes to access reality directly. Perhaps all knowledge is mediated through language, culture, or evolutionary history, frameworks that both enable and constrain understanding. Yet skepticism need not end in despair or relativism. By identifying the boundaries of knowledge, we might cultivate intellectual humility, a virtue increasingly rare in an age of polarization and information overload. Perhaps wisdom begins not with confident assertions, but with the Socratic recognition of how little we truly know. As consciousness gently loosens its hold, consider, what would change if you held your deepest convictions not as certainties, but as working hypotheses, provisionally accepted, always open to revision in light of new evidence or perspective? The Sorites paradox. When does removing a single grain of sand transform a heap into a non-heap? At what precise moment does adding one hair to a bald head make it no longer bald? A strange puzzle emerges from ordinary concepts. Imagine a heap of sand containing 10,000 grains. Remove one grain, surely it remains a heap. Remove another, still a heap. Continue this process. With each individual removal, it seems absurd to claim that a single grain makes the difference between heap and non-heap. Yet eventually, you're left with just one grain, clearly not a heap. This ancient paradox reveals how our everyday concepts often contain hidden vagueness. Where exactly does tall begin and average height end? When does a village become a town? No single degree Celsius transforms cold to warm. The paradox presents a troubling trilemma. Either precise boundaries exist where common sense says they don't, or removing a single grain can indeed transform a heap to a non-heap, or heaps don't exist at all. Each option contradicts our intuitions about ordinary concepts. Perhaps vague concepts are not defective but useful precisely because they lack sharp boundaries. They allow us to navigate a complex world without needing to specify exact thresholds. Maybe the mistake lies in assuming language must conform to classical logic, where everything must either definitely be X or definitely not be X. Yet this suggests something profound about reality itself. Perhaps the world contains genuine vagueness, with some features existing in degrees rather than absolutely. As you drift toward deeper calm, consider, how many of your fundamental concepts, person, consciousness, identity, love, might harbor similar vagueness at their core? What happens when we try to draw sharp lines through inherently fuzzy realities? The Quine-Duhem thesis. What if scientific theories can never be tested in isolation? What if every test actually evaluates an entire web of interconnected beliefs rather than a single hypothesis? A subtle revelation unfolds at the heart of scientific reasoning. When observations contradict predictions, scientists face a puzzling question: which belief should be abandoned? The simple story says we test individual hypotheses against evidence, but philosophers Pierre Duhem and Willard Van Orman Quine revealed a more complex reality. Consider a physicist whose experiment yields unexpected results. The contradiction could stem from the main hypothesis under investigation, or from background assumptions about the measuring equipment, auxiliary theories used in the experiment, mathematical principles applied, or even basic assumptions about how observation works. No experiment tests a hypothesis in isolation. When astronomers discovered Uranus wasn't following its predicted orbit, they could have questioned Newton's laws of motion. Instead, they hypothesized an undiscovered planet whose gravity was affecting Uranus, leading to Neptune's discovery. The choice of what to preserve and what to sacrifice isn't dictated by logic alone. This insight challenges the neat picture of science falsifying individual theories one by one. Instead, we face a web of belief where adjustments in one area ripple through the entire structure. Changes at the periphery preserve stability at the center, until accumulating anomalies force more radical revisions. Perhaps all knowledge works this way, not as isolated propositions tested individually, but as interconnected networks evaluated holistically against experience. As awareness begins to soften, consider, when encountering something that challenges your understanding, How do you decide which beliefs to question and which to preserve? What core convictions form the center of your web of belief? Coherence theory of truth. What if truth isn't about corresponding to reality, but about fitting perfectly within a coherent system of beliefs? The mind, clever as it is, seeks patterns that hang together. According to coherence theorists, a statement isn't true because it matches some external reality, but because it coheres with our broader network of beliefs. Truth becomes less about accurate representation and more about internal consistency and mutual support. Consider mathematics. Propositions are deemed true not by comparing them to some external mathematical reality, but by demonstrating their consistency with axioms and previously proven theorems. Perhaps all truth works similarly, with statements justified by their relationships to other accepted claims rather than by correspondence to something beyond belief. This view suggests we might think of knowledge as a web or puzzle, where each piece gains validity from its connections to other pieces. The most coherent overall system, the one with greatest explanatory power, simplicity, and internal harmony, claims the status of truth. Critics worry coherence could validate elaborate fantasies as long as they're internally consistent. Multiple coherent systems might exist, with no way to determine which represents reality. Yet coherence theorists respond that pragmatic concerns and new experiences inevitably constrain which systems remain coherent over time. Perhaps truth involves both coherence and some form of correspondence. Our beliefs must hang together internally while connecting meaningfully to our experiences of the world. As you settle deeper into tranquility, consider: do you judge new ideas primarily by how they fit with what you already believe? What might you accept if it cohered perfectly with everything else you know, even without direct evidence? Correspondence theory of truth. What if truth is simply when thoughts or statements align with reality? What if the mind's task is to create an accurate map of what actually exists? A whisper comes from common sense itself. According to correspondence theory, truth is a relationship between beliefs and reality. A statement is true when it corresponds to how things actually are in the world. Snow is white is true if and only if snow is in fact white. This intuitive view suggests an external reality exists independently of our minds, and our task is to represent it accurately. Like a map corresponding to terrain, true beliefs match the layout of reality, while false ones misrepresent it. Consider how we naturally think about truth in everyday contexts. When someone claims, "There's milk in the refrigerator," we check the fridge, not our other beliefs, to verify. Science similarly tests theories against observations rather than coherence alone. This suggests correspondence captures something essential about our concept of truth. Yet profound questions emerge when we probe deeper. How exactly do abstract thoughts correspond to concrete reality? Given we can only access reality through perception and conception, how can we ever step outside our beliefs to compare them with an unmediated world? Perhaps we can never fully escape our conceptual schemes to reach reality as it is in itself. Maybe correspondence offers the right intuition about truth, while requiring further theories about knowledge, perception, and language to explain how such correspondence is possible. As consciousness gently recedes, consider: what would it mean for your beliefs to truly correspond to reality? What aspects of existence might remain forever beyond your mind's capacity to represent accurately? Pragmatism. What if truth isn't about representing reality or maintaining coherence, but about what works? What if ideas are instruments for action rather than pictures of the world? A quiet revolution unfolds at the edges of philosophy. Pragmatism suggests we judge ideas not by their correspondence to reality or internal coherence, but by their practical consequences. An idea is true if it functions successfully in experience, if believing it helps us navigate life effectively. William James proposed that truth happens to an idea when it allows us to move between parts of experience with satisfaction. True ideas are those that can be validated, verified, corroborated in the course of experience. They cash out by connecting fruitfully with other experiences. Consider scientific theories. According to pragmatists, we accept them not because they mirror some observer-independent reality, but because they provide reliable predictions and empower effective action. Their truth lies in their utility as tools for organizing experience and enabling control over our environment. This approach shifts focus from abstract questions about representation to concrete questions about function. Rather than asking, "Does this belief correspond to reality?" pragmatists ask, "What difference would it make to believe this? What experiences would result? What actions would it enable?" Critics worry pragmatism reduces truth to mere usefulness or reduces to relativism. But sophisticated pragmatists argue that what works isn't merely subjective convenience, but must survive the test of ongoing experience in a community of inquirers. As you drift toward deeper stillness, consider, which of your beliefs matter most in terms of their effects on how you live? If two ideas explained your experiences equally well, but led to different actions, how would you choose between them? The free will problem. Are your choices truly your own? Do you author your actions, or are they determined by forces beyond your control? Some puzzles don't hide. They inhabit our most basic experience of being human. The free will problem emerges from two compelling but seemingly contradictory intuitions. On one hand, we experience ourselves as free agents making genuine choices. On the other hand, we live in a causal universe where every event appears determined by prior causes. When you deliberate between options, whether to take a new job or stay put, whether to forgive someone or hold a grudge, you feel as though multiple futures are genuinely possible, and your choice will determine which becomes actual. This sense of authoring your actions feels fundamental to moral responsibility, dignity, and meaning. Yet physical events, including brain processes, appear governed by causal laws. Your decisions emerge from brain states shaped by genetics, past experiences, and current circumstances, factors you didn't choose. If physical causes fully explain your choices, where is the freedom? If your thoughts and feelings result from neural processes following physical laws, how can your will be truly free? This tension has spawned multiple positions. Hard determinists deny free will exists. Libertarians insist some choices escape causal determination, and compatibilists argue freedom and determinism can coexist when properly understood. Perhaps the most profound challenge comes not from physics, but from finding a coherent concept of freedom itself. What would it mean for a choice to be freely willed rather than random or determined? What kind of causation would constitute genuine freedom? As awareness begins to soften, consider, does freedom require escape from causation altogether? Or might it involve a particular kind of causal process, one flowing through your authentic values and reasoned deliberation? Hard determinism. What if every choice you believe you make freely is actually determined completely by prior causes? What if free will is the grandest of all human illusions? A shadow flickers at the edge of self-understanding. Hard determinism makes a radical claim. Every event, including your thoughts and choices, is completely determined by prior causes according to natural laws. Your sense of freely deciding is merely an illusion. You could not have chosen otherwise given the exact same causal history. When you deliberate between options, the outcome is already settled by the state of your brain, your past experiences, your desires and beliefs, all of which were caused by factors beyond your control. Even the strongest feeling of freedom cannot change this causal reality. Consider how your choices emerge from preferences you didn't choose to have, influenced by genetics you didn't select, shaped by experiences you didn't arrange, arising from thoughts whose appearance in consciousness you don't control. The chain of causation extends backward beyond your birth, making your will an effect rather than a first cause. Hard determinists argue this view doesn't devalue human life, but places it properly within the natural order. It might even lead to greater compassion, seeing others' actions as inevitable products of circumstances rather than mysterious free choices. Yet this position faces profound challenges. If determinism makes free will impossible, it seemingly undermines moral responsibility, desert, and meaningful deliberation. Why deliberate if the outcome is predetermined? Why praise or blame people for actions they couldn't have avoided? As you release into deeper relaxation, wonder, if your choices are determined rather than free, does this realization itself change anything? Can understanding the causes of your actions create new possibilities, even within a determined framework? Compatibilism. What if freedom doesn't require escaping causation, but expressing your authentic self through your actions? What if determinism and free will are not enemies, but partners? The mind, clever as it is, often creates false dichotomies. Compatibilism suggests the ancient battle between free will and determinism stems from confusion about what freedom actually means. True freedom doesn't require breaking causal chains, but acting according to your own nature without external constraint. Consider two scenarios. In the first, you stay home because you want to read a book. In the second, you stay home because someone has locked the door from outside. Both outcomes are identical, but compatibilists argue only the first represents genuine freedom. You acting from your own desires rather than external coercion. Freedom, on this view, doesn't mean actions uncaused by prior events, an incoherent notion, but actions caused by your own values, desires, and reasoning. Your will is free when it expresses who you truly are, regardless of how your character was formed. David Hume suggested the opposite of freedom isn't determinism, but compulsion, being forced to act against your will. A person acts freely when they do what they want to do, even if their wants themselves are determined. This position preserves moral responsibility within a causal framework. You can be responsible for actions flowing from your character, even a determined character, because they genuinely express who you are. The crucial question becomes not whether your actions have causes, but what kind of causes they have. As consciousness gently loosens its hold, consider, what would it mean for your actions to express your authentic self? Does genuine freedom require escaping causation entirely, or is it found in becoming the primary cause of your actions through your own values and reasons? The consequence argument. What if the laws of nature combined with the past state of the universe leave no room for free will? What if every decision you make was inevitable from the beginning of time? A powerful chain of reasoning unfolds in philosophical quiet. The consequence argument, formulated by Peter van Inwagen, challenges compatibilist notions of freedom with elegant simplicity. If determinism is true, then our current choices are the inevitable consequences of the distant past and the laws of nature, neither of which we control. Consider this logical progression. If determinism holds, then the complete state of the universe in the distant past, combined with the laws of nature, entails every fact about the present, including your current choices. You cannot change the past. You cannot change the laws of nature. Therefore, you cannot change the consequences that follow necessarily from their combination, including your own actions. The argument suggests that determinism eliminates alternatives. If your choice to read this text right now was entailed by conditions before your birth combined with natural laws, then you could not possibly have done otherwise. And if you could not have done otherwise, in what sense was your choice free? This reasoning places enormous pressure on compatibilist accounts of freedom. If genuine choice requires the ability to do otherwise, and determinism eliminates this ability, then freedom and determinism cannot peacefully coexist. Yet questions remain. Does freedom really require the ability to have done otherwise? Or might it consist in acting from certain internal causes rather than external constraints, regardless of whether alternatives existed? As you drift toward deeper calm, consider, if your current thoughts follow inevitably from causes beyond your control, does this realization itself change anything about how you experience your apparent choices? The Frankfurt cases. What if you could be morally responsible for an action, even if you couldn't have done otherwise? What if alternative possibilities aren't necessary for free will? In a corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Philosopher Harry Frankfurt devised ingenious thought experiments, challenging the intuition that moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, a principle long considered self-evident. Imagine Jones, who plans to vote for a particular candidate of his own accord. Unknown to Jones, a neuroscientist has implanted a device in his brain that monitors his intentions. If Jones shows any sign of changing his mind, the device will intervene, forcing him to vote as originally planned. Jones never wavers in his decision, so the device remains dormant. He votes exactly as he would have, without the device present. The puzzle emerges. Jones couldn't have done otherwise. The device ensured that. Yet intuitively, he seems morally responsible for his vote because he acted from his own reasons, without any actual intervention. The hidden device removed alternative possibilities, without affecting the actual causal process leading to his decision. These cases suggest moral responsibility might depend not on whether you could have done otherwise, but on whether your action flowed from your own authentic reasoning process. What matters is how the choice actually happened, not whether alternatives existed. If Frankfurt cases succeed, they provide powerful support for compatibilism by showing that determinism's elimination of alternatives wouldn't necessarily undermine moral responsibility. As awareness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder: are you responsible for actions because you could have chosen differently, or because they authentically express your values and reasoning, regardless of whether alternatives were really possible? Libertarian free will. What if some of your actions escape the causal net entirely? What if you possess the remarkable power to initiate causal chains that aren't determined by prior events? A strange capacity stirs within the human mystery. Libertarian free will, unrelated to political libertarianism, makes a bold metaphysical claim. At least some human choices are not completely determined by prior causes. They involve a special kind of causation, where the agent initiates action that isn't merely the inevitable result of past events and natural laws. When you face a genuine choice, perhaps whether to speak a difficult truth or remain silent, libertarians claim something remarkable happens. You stand at a moment where multiple futures are genuinely possible, and you yourself determine which becomes actual. Your decision isn't random chance, nor the inevitable product of prior causes, but a distinctive third category: agent causation. This view preserves our strongest intuitions about moral responsibility. How could praise or blame be justified if your actions simply flow from causes beyond your control? True desert seems to require that you, as an agent, are the ultimate source of your actions, what philosophers call ultimate origination. Yet this position faces formidable challenges. If your choice isn't determined by your character, desires, and reasons, in what sense is it truly yours rather than random? If it is influenced by these factors, how does it escape determination? What scientific account could explain how agent causation interfaces with physical brain processes? Perhaps freedom requires something that transcends the physical, a capacity that places humans partly outside the causal structure governing the rest of nature. As you settle deeper into tranquility, consider: what would it mean if you possessed this remarkable power to inject genuine novelty into the universe, to be, in some small domain, a first cause rather than merely an effect? The causal theory of action. What distinguishes your genuine actions from things that merely happen to you? What makes a bodily movement truly yours rather than something your body simply does? Some illusions don't hide. They structure our most basic understanding of agency. The causal theory of action suggests what makes something your action, rather than a mere happening, is its causal history. Specifically, that it's caused in the right way by your mental states, like beliefs and desires. When you raise your arm to ask a question, this counts as an action, because your movement is caused by your desire to ask something, and your belief that raising your arm will accomplish this. When your arm jerks upward due to a muscle spasm, this isn't an action because, despite identical physical movement, it lacks the appropriate mental causation. This seemingly simple distinction becomes surprisingly complex. Consider deviant causal chains. A nervous public speaker wants to signal for water, but his anxiety causes his hand to shake, coincidentally resembling a water gesture. His desire caused the movement, but in the wrong way, through nervousness rather than intentional control. Though caused by the right mental states, most would say this wasn't truly his action. The theory raises profound questions about free will and responsibility. If actions are events caused by mental states, and mental states are themselves caused by prior events, where does genuine agency enter? Perhaps freedom lies not in escaping causation, but in certain mental states playing the right causal role in producing behavior. As consciousness begins to soften, wonder: what makes you the author of your actions rather than merely their setting? What invisible line separates what you do from what happens to you when both occur through your body? The problem of future contingents. Can statements about the future be true or false now? If tomorrow's events aren't yet determined, what makes predictions about them true or false today? A whisper comes from ancient paradoxes. Consider the statement: there will be a sea battle tomorrow. If determinism is true, this statement has a definite truth value now. It's either true or false, depending on what will actually happen. But if the future remains genuinely open, with multiple possibilities, what makes this statement true or false at present? Aristotle confronted this problem by suggesting statements about future contingents, events that might or might not happen, are neither true nor false until the events occur. This preserves genuine possibility at the cost of violating the principle of bivalence, the logical rule that every proposition must be either true or false. Others maintain bivalence by arguing that statements about the future derive their truth from what will actually happen, even if this isn't determined yet. There will be a sea battle tomorrow is true now if and only if a sea battle occurs tomorrow, regardless of whether that outcome is currently determined. This puzzle connects deeply to questions about time, determinism, and free will. If statements about your future choices already have determinate truth values, does this threaten your freedom? Does meaningful choice require an open future where multiple possibilities remain genuinely possible? Some theologians face a related dilemma. If God has infallible foreknowledge of future events, including your actions, were you truly free in performing them? How can perfect divine foreknowledge coexist with genuine human freedom? As you release into deeper relaxation, consider, is tomorrow's path already laid out, merely awaiting discovery? Or does the future remain genuinely unwritten, with multiple possibilities that collapse into actuality only when the moment arrives? The paradox of omnipotence. Can an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that even they cannot lift it? What happens when unlimited power confronts its own limitations? A strange contradiction emerges at the boundaries of theological thought. If God is omnipotent, able to do anything, can God create a task that God cannot perform? If yes, then there's something God cannot do, lift the stone. If no, then there's also something God cannot do, create such a stone. Either answer seems to contradict divine omnipotence. This ancient puzzle reveals potential incoherence in the very concept of unlimited power. Perhaps omnipotence needs refinement rather than rejection. Many theologians define omnipotence not as the ability to do literally anything, including logical contradictions, but as the ability to do anything that is logically possible. Creating a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift is self-contradictory, like creating a square circle or a married bachelor. The task describes a logical impossibility rather than a genuine limitation of power. God's inability to perform logical contradictions no more limits omnipotence than does God's inability to cease being God. Others suggest omnipotence means having all powers that are possible to have. Since the power to create something beyond one's power is inherently contradictory, it isn't a genuine power that any being could possess. This paradox invites reflection on the relationship between divine attributes and logical necessity. Is logic something God created, or does it transcend even divine power? Can we meaningfully conceive of a being beyond the constraints of logical possibility? As awareness gently recedes, consider, what would it mean for power to be truly unlimited? Are there inherent contradictions in the very concept of absolute power, or does the paradox merely reveal the boundaries of human understanding? The problem of evil. How could a world containing such profound suffering be created by a being who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good? Why would a benevolent God permit such darkness? The mind, clever as it is, faces its most ancient theological puzzle. The problem of evil emerges from an apparent contradiction between divine perfection and worldly suffering. If God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, why does evil exist? God must either lack the power to prevent suffering, lack knowledge of it, lack the goodness to want to prevent it, or not exist at all. Consider the immense suffering throughout history. Children dying of painful diseases, natural disasters destroying innocent lives, the Holocaust, torture, abuse. Could an all-good being who knows of such suffering and has the power to prevent it choose not to intervene? What possible justification could exist? Various responses, theodicies, attempt to resolve this tension. Some suggest evil is necessary for free will. Others claim suffering enables soul-making and moral growth. Some propose our limited perspective prevents us from seeing how apparent evils contribute to greater goods beyond our understanding. Yet these responses face powerful objections. How does childhood cancer contribute to freedom? Why couldn't an omnipotent God create beings who freely choose good? Why would a perfect being need such a painful process to achieve divine aims? Perhaps the most profound aspect of this problem isn't philosophical but existential. It emerges not from abstract reasoning, but from the lived experience of suffering itself. For many, the intellectual problem fades beside the experiential challenge of maintaining faith amidst profound pain. As you drift towards sleep's embrace, consider, if there is divine purpose behind suffering, what might transform this painful mystery into something meaningful? Or must we accept that some aspects of existence resist all attempts at rational explanation? Moral relativism. What if what you call right and wrong are merely reflections in a cultural mirror? What if morality itself is as fluid as the rivers that flow through different landscapes of human experience? In the quiet spaces between certainty, a question begins to form. Consider how the same action, viewed through different cultural lenses, transforms completely. What appears virtuous in one society is condemned in another, not because either is mistaken, but because morality itself might be contextual rather than absolute. The moral relativist sees ethics as languages with different grammars and vocabularies, each perfectly suited for those who speak them. The ancient Greeks celebrated behaviors the Victorians would later hide behind closed doors. Eastern philosophies embrace paradoxes. Western minds struggle to reconcile. What we call moral truth may be merely the view from where we stand, a horizon that shifts as we move. Perhaps your deepest moral convictions are not universal laws, but beautiful local patterns, intricate designs in the kaleidoscope of human values. The taboos you hold sacred might be another culture's traditions, your ethical certainties, another's confusions. This dissolves not just particular moral judgments, but the very foundation of ethical progress itself. If all moral frameworks are equally valid within their contexts, what basis remains for moral reform? If your ethical compass is merely a cultural artifact, how can you navigate beyond the waters of your own tradition? As the boundaries between right and wrong begin to blur like watercolors on wet paper, ask yourself, are your moral certainties truly universal, or are they exquisite illusions, local weather patterns mistaken for cosmic laws? Utilitarianism. What if all moral questions collapse into a single calculation, the balance of pleasure and pain across all conscious beings? What if rightness itself is nothing more than the mathematics of happiness? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its longing for simplicity. Utilitarianism whispers that morality has nothing to do with rules, intentions, or principles, only consequences rippling through the ocean of experience matter. This view sees happiness and suffering as the only true moral currencies. Every action trades in this ancient economy of feeling. The right path is simply that which creates the greatest joy for the greatest number, a moral mathematics of collective well-being, where each being's experience weighs equally in the balance. Yet something elusive remains in this calculus. Can you truly measure one person's bliss against another's agony? Would you sacrifice one innocent to save many? When the trolley hurtles down the tracks toward 5 people, with a lever that would divert it to kill just one, does the mathematics capture what truly matters? Perhaps ethics resists reduction to calculation, just as consciousness itself defies complete explanation. The utilitarian scale might weigh pleasure and pain, but can it measure justice, dignity, or rights? Does something essential dissolve when we reduce morality to quantities? As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, if ethics were merely mathematics, why would moral questions continue to haunt us across millennia? What invisible value escapes the utilitarian's balance? Kantian ethics. What if morality has nothing to do with consequences, but emerges from something deeper, universal principles that would bind all rational beings across all possible worlds? Some illusions don't hide, they wear the face of reason. Kant's ethical vision doesn't measure outcomes or cultural contexts. It seeks the timeless patterns that any rational mind would recognize, regardless of circumstance or desire. In this view, humans are never mere instruments for others' happiness. Each person exists as an end in themselves, carrying infinite worth that cannot be calculated or traded. The categorical imperative asks not, what works, but what if everyone did this? It seeks actions that could become universal laws without contradiction. This approach sees dignity not as something we grant each other, but as something we recognize, an inherent worth that precedes all calculation of consequences. Truth-telling becomes right not because it produces good outcomes, but because a world where everyone lied would dissolve into contradiction. Yet this rational architecture feels strangely distant from our lived moral experience. The Kantian mind might refuse to lie even to save a life, valuing principle over compassion. Is something essential lost when ethics becomes pure reason divorced from human feeling? As awareness drifts towards sleep's gentle embrace, wonder. What if our deepest moral intuitions come neither from calculation nor from abstract reason, but from something more mysterious still? What unseen rhythm guides our sense of right and wrong beneath the surface of conscious thought? The trolley problem. What if our most deeply held moral frameworks collapse when pressed to their logical conclusions? What if ethics itself contains paradoxes that cannot be resolved, only witnessed? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a thought experiment that reveals the fault lines in our moral foundations. Imagine a runaway trolley barreling toward 5 innocent people who cannot escape. You stand by a lever that would divert the trolley to a different track, where it would kill only one person. What would you do? This deceptively simple scenario splits our moral intuitions like light through a prism. The utilitarian sees a clear choice: sacrifice 1 to save 5. The Kantian hesitates, questioning whether we can use a human life as mere means to an end. The virtue ethicist wonders what kind of person would be formed by making such a choice. Perhaps what makes this problem so haunting is that it strips away context and forces a choice between competing moral values. Neither option feels fully right, yet we must choose. The trolley rushes forward while we deliberate, revealing how our moral frameworks fracture under pressure. Variations of the problem only deepen the paradox. Would you push a large man off a footbridge to stop the trolley and save 5, using his body as an obstacle? Most who would pull the lever would not push the man, though the mathematical outcome is identical. Something shifts when your action directly uses another's body, rather than merely redirects an existing threat. As consciousness begins to loosen its borders, consider, does the impossible choice reveal morality's limits, or does it show that ethics lives precisely in these unbearable tensions, the spaces where certainty dissolves into mystery? Moral absolutism. What if certain actions are intrinsically right or wrong, regardless of their consequences, cultural context, or historical period? What if moral truth is as fixed and discoverable as mathematical truth? In a corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Moral absolutism beckons with the promise of certainty, fixed ethical truths that transcend culture, circumstance, and consequence. It whispers that some actions are fundamentally right or wrong, regardless of time, place, or outcome. This view sees moral laws not as human constructions, but as discoveries, eternal principles waiting to be recognized, like mathematical truths. Murder is wrong, not because societies condemn it, or because it causes suffering, but because it violates something fundamental in the moral fabric of reality itself. Absolutism offers comfort in its certainty, a fixed star by which to navigate the turbulent waters of ethical life. It suggests that moral progress is possible precisely because there are objective standards against which cultural practices can be measured. Without such standards, how could we condemn historical injustices or call for reform? Yet even as absolutism offers this comfort, questions emerge from the shadows. How do we access these transcendent moral truths? Why do seemingly universal principles shift across history? And if moral facts exist independent of human minds, what strange metaphysical realm contains them? As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, what if morality is neither purely relative nor absolutely fixed, but something more mysterious? A dance between universal principles and particular contexts, between timeless truths and evolving understanding. Perhaps ethics itself is a beautiful paradox, a necessary illusion that forms the invisible architecture of human connection. Virtue ethics. What if the path to right action isn't about rules or consequences, but about becoming a certain kind of person? What if ethics is less about what you do and more about who you are? A strange thing happens when we shift our moral gaze from actions to character. Virtue ethics suggests that goodness emerges not from following principles or calculating outcomes, but from cultivating excellence of character, developing virtues like courage, honesty, and compassion until they become second nature. This ancient approach doesn't ask, "What should I do?" but "What kind of person should I become?" The virtuous person doesn't need a rule book. They perceive the right action through the lens of developed character, just as a master musician intuitively knows which note to play next. Perhaps morality isn't a matter of memorizing principles, but of training perception, learning to see situations clearly through virtues developed over a lifetime. The courageous person recognizes when bravery is needed. The wise person discerns when caution is appropriate. Each virtue represents a balance point between extremes. Courage, the middle path between recklessness and cowardice. Yet questions emerge from the shadows of this approach. How do we determine which traits count as virtues? How do we resolve conflicts between different virtues? And if character is shaped by culture, doesn't virtue ethics risk collapsing into relativism? As consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, consider, what if ethical truth isn't found in universal rules or calculations, but in the lived wisdom of those who embody excellence of character? What virtues quietly shape your moral perception beneath the surface of conscious thought? The is-ought problem. What if there's an unbridgeable gap between describing how the world is and prescribing how it ought to be? What invisible leap takes us from facts to values? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with hidden transitions. We observe natural patterns and derive moral principles, rarely noticing the mysterious leap between them. We note that something exists or happens in nature, then somehow conclude that it should be this way. David Hume recognized this subtle confusion, that no collection of purely descriptive statements about what is can, by themselves, entail any conclusion about what ought to be. Facts and values inhabit different realms. The bridge between them is never purely logical. This insight reveals a curious blindness in many moral arguments. When someone claims that something is unnatural and therefore wrong, they've made this very leap without justification. When evolutionary psychology explains behavior patterns, it cannot tell us whether we should embrace or transcend them. Perhaps this gap isn't a problem, but a profound truth about morality itself. That ethical principles aren't waiting to be discovered in nature like physical laws, but emerge from something more mysterious: human values, commitments, and concerns that we bring to our understanding of the world. As your awareness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, where do your deepest values come from, if not from facts alone? What invisible bridge carries you from what you see in the world to what you believe should be? The Euthyphro Dilemma. What if our understanding of goodness contains a paradox so ancient it has whispered through philosophy for thousands of years? What if divine command and moral goodness circle each other in an endless dance? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Plato captured this paradox in a deceptively simple question. Does God command what is good because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? If the first option is true, if God commands things because they are already good, then goodness exists independently of divine will. Morality has foundations beyond even divinity itself. But if the second is true, if things are good simply because God commands them, then morality becomes arbitrary, dependent only on divine decree. This ancient puzzle reveals a tension in how we think about moral foundations. If goodness has reasons beyond authority, where do these reasons come from? But if goodness is simply what authority declares, how can it bind us with its normative force? The dilemma extends beyond theology to any attempt to ground ethics in authority, whether divine, traditional, or legal. Either the authority recognizes independent moral truths, or morality reduces to commands without deeper justification. Perhaps what makes this puzzle so enduring is that it reveals something essential about moral thinking itself, our dual commitment to seeing ethics as both rooted in reasons and carrying undeniable authority. As consciousness begins to loosen its grasp, consider, what ultimately grounds your sense of right and wrong? Does goodness have foundations that precede all authority, or does authority itself somehow create the good? The doctrine of double effect. What if intention shapes the moral landscape in ways we rarely recognize? What if the same outcome, approached with different mental states, transforms completely in its ethical significance? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of consequences. The doctrine of double effect suggests a subtle distinction. Harm we directly intend differs morally from identical harm we merely foresee as a side effect of our actions. Consider the surgeon who amputates a limb, knowing it causes pain but intending to heal. Compare this to someone who inflicts identical pain with the primary intention to harm. Though the immediate suffering might be the same, something fundamental shifts when intention changes. This doctrine offers a path through impossible moral terrain. It suggests why we might accept civilian casualties as tragic side effects of justified warfare, but condemn terrorism that directly targets civilians. It explains why a doctor might administer pain medication that foreseeably hastens death in a terminal patient, while prohibiting euthanasia that intends death. Yet questions emerge from the shadows of this distinction. Can intention alone bear such moral weight? Can we truly separate what we intend from what we knowingly cause? Does this doctrine sometimes provide convenient moral shelter for actions we wish to justify? As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider: does the moral universe respond not just to what happens in the physical world, but to the invisible architecture of your intentions? What unseen patterns of thought shape the ethical significance of your actions? The anthropic principle. What if our very existence as observers shapes what we can possibly observe about the universe? What if the cosmos appears finely tuned for life precisely because we wouldn't be here to notice if it weren't? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a paradox about our place in the cosmos. The universe appears extraordinarily fine-tuned for life. If fundamental constants varied by tiny amounts, stars couldn't form, chemistry couldn't function, consciousness couldn't emerge. The anthropic principle whispers an unsettling explanation. We observe a universe compatible with our existence because we couldn't possibly observe one incompatible with it. Our very presence as observers selects which universe we can witness. This isn't mere philosophical play, but touches something essential about knowledge itself. Any observation we make about reality is already filtered through the condition that it must be compatible with observers like us existing to make that observation. Perhaps we inhabit just one of infinitely many universes, each with different physical constants, a vast multiverse where we necessarily find ourselves in one of the rare regions hospitable to life. Or perhaps something deeper is at work, a fundamental connection between consciousness and the cosmos that we've only begun to glimpse. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, is the apparent design of the universe an illusion created by observer selection? Or does the remarkable fit between cosmos and consciousness hint at something more mysterious about reality itself? The Fermi Paradox. What if we are profoundly alone in the vast silence of space? What if the greatest mystery isn't what exists beyond our world, but what doesn't? A strange thing happens when we look up at the countless stars and consider the mathematics of existence. Our galaxy alone contains billions of stars, many with planets. If even a tiny fraction developed life and a smaller fraction developed intelligence, the cosmos should be buzzing with civilizations. Yet we hear nothing. The silence is deafening. This eerie quiet is the Fermi Paradox, the contradiction between the high probability of extraterrestrial intelligence and our complete lack of evidence for it. Perhaps civilizations invariably destroy themselves once they develop advanced technology. Perhaps interstellar travel is fundamentally impossible. Or perhaps something filters out intelligent life before it can announce itself to the cosmos. Most unsettling is the possibility that we're not missing the evidence, we're misinterpreting it. What if alien intelligence surrounds us in forms we cannot recognize, operating on principles beyond our comprehension? Like ants unable to understand human civilization built atop their hills, we might be immersed in evidence we lack the capacity to perceive. Perhaps the true boundary isn't between Earth and space, but between the kinds of minds that can recognize each other across the void. As your consciousness begins to drift, consider, is the cosmos truly empty, or are we simply unable to hear its conversations? Is the silence evidence of absence or of our own limitations? The multiverse theory. What if our universe is merely one bubble in an infinite cosmic foam? What if every possibility that could exist, does exist, somewhere? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its longing for singularity. Multiverse theory suggests that reality isn't one universe, but an endless array of them, each with different physical laws, different histories, different versions of you, making different choices at every crossroads. In some frameworks, every quantum possibility branches reality into parallel universes. In others, regions of spacetime beyond our cosmic horizon have fundamentally different properties. Some propose mathematical structures so vast that they contain every logically possible world. This vision dissolves our intuitive sense of uniqueness. Somewhere, a version of you is reading these words slightly differently arranged. Somewhere, dinosaurs were never extinguished by an asteroid. Somewhere, the laws of physics make consciousness impossible. Each universe is sealed from the others, yet all exist within the same ultimate reality. Perhaps what we call existence is vaster and stranger than we've imagined. Not a single story unfolding, but every possible story happening simultaneously across an infinite landscape of realities. As awareness drifts towards sleep's gentle embrace, wonder, if infinite universes contain every possibility, what does that mean for the significance of this one? Does multiplicity diminish uniqueness, or somehow make it more precious? The simulation argument. What if the reality you experience so vividly is merely an ancestral simulation, a sophisticated computer program running in a world beyond your perception? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Consider three possibilities. Either advanced civilizations inevitably destroy themselves before creating realistic simulations, or they have no interest in creating such simulations, or we are almost certainly living in a simulation ourselves. This peculiar trilemma follows from simple probability. If even one civilization ever creates numerous ancestor simulations, the number of simulated minds would vastly outnumber real ones. And if simulated minds can't tell they're simulated, odds heavily favor our being among them. The simulation hypothesis dissolves the boundary between physical and virtual. The laws of physics become merely the program parameters set by unseen creators. Consciousness itself becomes a pattern that can run equally well on biological neurons or digital substrates. Perhaps reality is nested like Russian dolls, simulations within simulations. Perhaps the true nature of existence isn't matter or energy, but information processing itself. The universe becomes less a thing and more a thought, a computational structure in which we are patterns rather than particles. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, would it matter if your entire reality were a simulation? If consciousness feels the same either way, does the distinction between real and simulated dissolve into meaninglessness? The problem of the infinite. What if infinity isn't merely very large, but fundamentally different? A concept that breaks our most basic intuitions about numbers, time, and existence. Some illusions don't hide, they wear the face of comprehension. We use the word infinite casually, as if it were merely a very large number. Yet true infinity shatters the mathematics of the finite world and leads to mind-bending paradoxes. Consider a hotel with infinitely many rooms, all occupied. Impossibly, it can still accommodate infinitely many new guests by moving each current guest to twice their room number, freeing up all odd-numbered rooms. Stranger still, the hotel could accommodate infinitely many infinite groups of new guests, a concept beyond our spatial intuition. Infinity challenges our understanding of probability too. If you select a random number from the infinite set of integers, the probability of choosing any specific number is 0, yet some number must be chosen. In an infinite universe, every possible configuration of matter would occur not just once, but infinitely many times, including perfect copies of Earth and everyone on it. Perhaps infinity isn't merely quantitative, but qualitative, not just more of the same, but something fundamentally different that our finite minds struggle to grasp. Maybe the universe isn't infinite, but merely unbounded, like the surface of a sphere that curves back upon itself. As consciousness begins to loosen its borders, consider, does infinity exist in reality or only in mathematics? Is the concept itself a clue that our minds operate in ways fundamentally different from the physical world? Quantum mechanics and consciousness. What if the deepest mystery isn't in distant galaxies, but in the connection between your mind and the fundamental nature of reality? What invisible thread might connect consciousness to quantum phenomena? there's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a curious resonance between quantum physics and the nature of mind. Quantum systems exist in superpositions of multiple states until observed, when they mysteriously collapse into single definite states. Similarly, consciousness somehow unifies the brain's distributed processing into a single subjective experience. Some theorists have proposed that consciousness might involve quantum processes in neural microtubules. Others suggest the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, how observation affects quantum states, might be related to the hard problem of consciousness, how physical processes create subjective experience. This connection remains controversial. Critics argue the brain is too warm and wet for quantum coherence to survive. Yet the parallels persist. Both consciousness and quantum reality seem to occupy an ambiguous territory between determinism and possibility, between the physical and something more elusive. Perhaps what makes this relationship so compelling is that both quantum physics and consciousness challenge the materialist paradigm that has dominated science. Both suggest reality may be more fluid, more observer-dependent than our everyday experience indicates. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, could your conscious awareness and the fundamental nature of reality be connected in ways science is only beginning to grasp? Is the observer effect a hint that mind and matter aren't as separate as they seem? The cosmological argument. What if the universe's very existence poses a question that science alone cannot answer? What if the chain of causes stretching backward through time requires a first cause beyond time itself? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its acceptance of infinite regress. The cosmological argument suggests a profound puzzle. Everything in our experience has a cause, yet an infinite chain of causes seems logically problematic. If everything that exists requires something prior to explain it, what explains existence itself? This ancient argument proposes that the chain of causation must ultimately terminate in a necessary being, something that exists by its own nature, rather than being caused by something else. This first cause would need to be timeless, changeless, and immaterial to avoid the very need for explanation that sparked our inquiry. Modern physics complicates this picture. Quantum fluctuations suggest particles can appear without apparent cause. Inflationary cosmology proposes the universe might be just one bubble in an eternal multiverse. Yet the question remains, why does anything exist rather than nothing? Perhaps our intuitions about causality, formed by experiences within time, break down when applied to the origin of time itself. Maybe being and nothingness aren't the clear-cut opposites we imagine, but related aspects of a deeper reality we only dimly perceive. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder. What explains the remarkable fact that anything exists at all? Is the universe self-sustaining, or does it point beyond itself to something our minds can barely grasp? The ontological argument. What if the very concept of perfection contains the seeds of its own existence? What if the greatest possible being cannot be merely imaginary? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. The ontological argument suggests that if we understand the concept of a maximally perfect being, one lacking no perfection, then such a being must exist in reality, not merely in imagination. This follows from a curious premise. Existence in reality is greater than existence merely in the mind. If the greatest possible being existed only in our thoughts, we could conceive of a greater being that existed in reality too. But this would contradict our original concept of a being lacking no perfection. This argument makes the remarkable claim to prove existence from pure thought, no empirical evidence needed. It suggests the boundary between conceivability and reality isn't as solid as we assume, at least when it comes to necessary beings. Yet something feels amiss. Can concepts really entail existence? Does perfection necessarily include existence? Critics argue the argument subtly smuggles its conclusion into its premises, performing logical sleight of hand. Perhaps what makes this puzzle so enduring is that it probes the relationship between thought and reality, between what we can conceive and what must be. It asks whether certain concepts might be so rich with implications that they spill over from imagination into existence. As your awareness begins to drift, consider, can pure reasoning alone ever establish what exists beyond our minds? Or does the ontological argument reveal more about the limitations of human thought than about ultimate reality? Time travel, paradoxes. What if the flow of time isn't the one-way river we experience, but a landscape we might someday navigate in multiple directions? What happens when causality folds back upon itself? Some illusions don't hide, they wear the face of temporal progression. Time travel paradoxes reveal the strange logical knots that form when we imagine causation flowing backward as well as forward through time. Consider the grandfather paradox. If you traveled back in time and prevented your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you would never be born. But then how could you travel back to prevent their meeting? Or the bootstrap paradox. If you traveled back in time and gave the young Einstein the theory of relativity, who actually created the theory? These puzzles suggest either time travel is impossible, creates alternate timelines, or operates according to a bizarre consistency principle where the past already includes all effects of future time travelers. Perhaps time isn't a line but a closed loop, with cause and effect forming a circle with no beginning or end. The implications extend beyond science fiction. If the future already exists in some sense, as Einstein's relativity suggests, then what happens to free will? If time is more like a dimension we move through rather than a process of becoming, does that make the universe a static four-dimensional block where change is merely an illusion? As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, is the human sense of time as flowing from past to future merely a limited perspective on a more complex reality? What would it mean if past, present, and future all exist equally in a timeless whole? The fine-tuning argument. What if the universe appears precisely calibrated for life not by chance, but by design? What if the remarkable physical constants that allow consciousness to emerge whisper of something beyond random processes? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a curious feature of our cosmos. The fundamental constants of nature, the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, the strong nuclear force, all fall within extraordinarily narrow ranges that permit complex structures like stars, planets, and ultimately life. Slight changes to these values would create universes where matter couldn't form stable structures. The chances of randomly arriving at values permitting life seem vanishingly small, like finding a single marked grain of sand on all Earth's beaches. This fine-tuning suggests three possibilities: extraordinary cosmic luck, a multiverse containing all possible physical constants, or intentional design by some intelligence. The first seems implausible given the odds. The second multiplies entities beyond necessity. The third raises questions about the nature of this designer. Perhaps this apparent fine-tuning reveals something fundamental about the relationship between consciousness and cosmos, a hint that mind isn't merely an accidental byproduct, but somehow essential to the universe's nature. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, is the remarkable fitness of the universe for consciousness merely coincidence, the product of selection effects, or evidence of purpose woven into the fabric of reality itself? The social contract. What if the society around you, with its laws, norms, and institutions, rests upon an agreement no one actually signed? What invisible understanding shapes human communities? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its acceptance of unexamined social arrangements. The social contract theory suggests that legitimate political authority doesn't derive from divine right or natural hierarchy, but from the implicit consent of the governed. In this view, individuals surrender certain natural freedoms to gain the security and benefits of organized society. No historical moment marks this agreement. It's a theoretical construct, explaining why rational people would accept limitations on their actions. Different philosophers envision this hypothetical agreement differently. Hobbes saw it as escape from a nasty, brutish, and short, natural state of war. Locke emphasized protection of natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Rousseau focused on collective self-governance that preserves freedom through participation. This approach raises profound questions. What happens when some never meaningfully consent to the contract? What about those, whether through disability, poverty, or discrimination, who receive few benefits while bearing heavy burdens? Can consent be meaningful when alternatives are impractical or non-existent? Perhaps the social contract is less an explanation of historical origins than an ongoing negotiation, a conversation each generation must renew about the proper balance between individual freedom and collective governance. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, what implicit agreements shape your social world? What would a truly just social contract include? And who would need to be at the table when it's drafted? The problem of political authority. What if the power that governs your daily life rests on foundations more mysterious than you've ever considered? What invisible thread connects command to obedience in human societies? A strange thing happens when we begin to question political authority. The state claims the right to do what would be wrong for any individual, to take your property through taxation, to restrict your movement, to imprison you for breaking its rules. Yet most accept this asymmetry without question. This puzzle deepens when we seek its justification. Social contracts remain unsigned. Consent theories falter when consent is rarely explicitly given. Democratic processes leave minorities bound by majorities' decisions. Appeals to good consequences raise the question of who determines what outcomes count as good. Perhaps most troubling is that political authority commands not just compliance but moral deference, the belief that we ought to obey, rather than merely that we must obey to avoid punishment. This normative force seems to transcend the mere threat of violence that backs it. Some philosophers suggest political authority is merely an illusion, a convenient fiction masking institutionalized coercion. Others argue it emerges organically from our social nature and shared need for coordination. Yet the boundary between legitimate authority and mere power remains elusive. As consciousness begins to loosen its grip, consider what makes some commands from some entities create genuine obligations, while identical commands from others do not. Is political authority a necessary structure for human flourishing, or a spell we've cast upon ourselves? Utilitarianism in politics. What if all political questions could be reduced to a single calculation? The greatest happiness for the greatest number? What if the rightness of laws and policies had nothing to do with rights or fairness, but only consequences? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its longing for simplicity. Political utilitarianism suggests that governments should aim solely to maximize overall welfare or happiness, regardless of how that welfare is distributed or achieved. This approach has intuitive appeal. If politics aims to improve human lives, shouldn't we simply choose whatever arrangements produce the most improvement? The utilitarian ruler needs no complicated theories of justice or rights, only good evidence about what increases total welfare. Yet shadows gather around this straightforward view. Whose happiness counts? Does everyone's welfare receive equal weight, or do some deserve priority? And what about the tyranny of the majority? The possibility that significant suffering for a few might be justified by small benefits for many. Perhaps most troubling is that utilitarianism might justify violating what we intuitively consider inviolable rights if doing so produced better consequences. The torture of innocence, the punishment of the known innocent, even slavery might be justified if the welfare calculations worked out favorably. As your awareness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, is politics ultimately about maximizing a single value like welfare, or about balancing multiple irreducible values that sometimes conflict? Can any political formula capture the full complexity of what matters in human societies? Anarchy versus government. What if the greatest threat to human freedom and flourishing isn't foreign invasion or criminal activity, but the very institution created to protect us from these dangers? What if government itself is the problem it claims to solve? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Anarchist philosophy suggests a radical possibility, that human societies could function without formal government, through voluntary association and mutual aid, rather than hierarchical authority. This view sees the state not as a necessary guardian, but as a monopoly on violence that inevitably becomes captured by the powerful. It questions whether giving certain humans extraordinary authority over others ever leads to justice rather than exploitation. Perhaps the medicine of government is worse than the disease of private predation. Critics counter that without central authority, society would collapse into violence and chaos. Yet anarchists point to examples of stateless societies that have functioned through reputation systems, customary law, and community enforcement. Perhaps our inability to imagine life without government reflects lack of imagination rather than impossibility. The anarchist challenge forces us to question whether the evils governments prevent outweigh the evils they cause through war, oppression, and systematic violence. It asks whether human nature requires external constraint, or if cooperation might emerge organically from free association. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider: is government a necessary structure for complex society, or merely a phase in human social evolution? What invisible cooperation might emerge if authority's shadow were lifted? Rawls' theory of justice. What if fairness could be distilled from a thought experiment? A mental journey behind a veil of ignorance where you design society's rules without knowing your place within it. Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of merit. John Rawls' theory suggests that truly just principles would emerge if we could temporarily forget our social positions, natural talents, and personal interests, choosing principles from an original position of radical equality. Behind this veil of ignorance, not knowing whether you'd be born rich or poor, talented or ordinary, majority or minority, what principles would you select? Rawls believed rational beings would choose two principles. First, equal basic liberties for all. Second, allowing inequalities only if they benefit the least advantaged. This approach sees justice as fairness, principles all could accept regardless of their particular circumstances. It suggests that much of what determines our social position, natural talents, family circumstances, social class, is morally arbitrary. No one deserves advantages from the natural lottery of birth. Yet questions emerge from the shadows of this elegant framework. Can we truly set aside our actual identities to reach this impartial viewpoint? Would real people behind the veil choose Rawls' principles, or different ones? Does focusing on distribution of primary goods neglect other important aspects of justice? As consciousness begins to loosen its borders, consider: if you could redesign society's basic structure without knowing your place within it, what principles would guide your choices? What invisible biases might still shape your vision of justice? Libertarianism. What if the only legitimate political principle was the non-aggression principle? That force is justified solely to protect against force or fraud. What if freedom from interference trumped all other political values? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a vision of politics built not on utopian outcomes, but on inviolable rights. Libertarianism suggests that individuals own themselves completely, that all legitimate exchanges must be voluntary, and that the only justified political power is that which prevents rights violations. This philosophy sees taxation as coercive taking, regulatory restrictions as violations of liberty, and most government functions as unjustified interference in free human interaction. It envisions a minimal state, protecting only against force, fraud, and breach of contract, or no state at all. The libertarian vision celebrates spontaneous order, the complex coordination that emerges when individuals pursue their own ends through voluntary exchange. It suggests that most social problems arise not from too little government, but from too much interference in natural market processes. Yet this framework raises profound questions. Can property rights exist without community recognition? Does complete self-ownership allow selling oneself into slavery? Can truly voluntary choices emerge from radically unequal starting positions? And what about public goods that markets struggle to provide? As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, what obligations do we owe each other beyond non-interference? Is liberty merely freedom from coercion, or does it require certain resources and opportunities to be meaningful? Communitarianism. What if our very identities are not possessions we own, but stories we inherit? What if the liberal emphasis on autonomous individuals misses the communal soil from which personhood grows? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its illusion of independence. Communitarianism suggests that we are fundamentally social beings, constituted by our relationships and the traditions in which we're embedded, rather than existing prior to them. This view challenges the image of individuals as self-created atoms who voluntarily form social bonds. Instead, it sees persons as fundamentally situated within communities that shape their values, identities, and possibilities. The question, "Who am I?" can only be answered through reference to the communities that formed you. Political communitarianism seeks to balance individual rights with responsibilities to the community. It emphasizes shared values, civic virtue, and the importance of maintaining the social bonds that make meaningful life possible. It suggests that excessive emphasis on rights and autonomy has fractured the communal structures that give life meaning. Yet questions emerge about which communities deserve our allegiance and what happens when communal values conflict with individual flourishing. Who defines community values? What about those who find themselves outside mainstream communities or caught between competing ones? As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, how much of what you consider yourself is actually a gift from communities that shaped you? What invisible inheritances form the background assumptions of your worldview? The harm principle. What if the only legitimate reason to restrict another's freedom was to prevent harm to others? What invisible boundary separates justified constraint from unjustified interference? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. John Stuart Mill's harm principle suggests a clear dividing line for legitimate power. Society may coerce individuals only to prevent harm to others, never to protect them from themselves or to enforce moral or cultural norms. This principle carves out a protected sphere of self-regarding action immune from social control. Your choices about what to read, who to love, what to believe, how to live, as long as they don't harm others, should remain beyond the reach of both government and social pressure. Yet the simplicity of this principle dissolves upon closer examination. What counts as harm? Does offense qualify? What about indirect harms like reinforcing harmful stereotypes? And what about harms to abstract entities like society or the environment, rather than specific individuals? Perhaps most challenging is determining when harm is sufficiently serious and probable to justify restriction. A society taking the harm principle seriously would likely be more permissive than most existing ones, allowing activities many find distasteful as long as they remain consensual. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, where would you draw the line between harmful actions justifying interference and merely self-regarding choices that should remain free? What invisible assumptions shape your intuitions about when society may legitimately restrict liberty? The state of nature. What if we could strip away civilization's veneer to glimpse human nature in its rawest form? What would humanity be without law, government, and social constraint? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of necessity. The state of nature thought experiment imagines humans before or without political society, asking what this pre-political condition reveals about our nature and the foundations of political legitimacy. Hobbes envisioned this state as a war of all against all, a condition of radical insecurity where life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Fear drives humans to establish absolute sovereignty for protection. Locke saw it more optimistically as governed by natural law, but still unsafe enough to require government to secure natural rights. Rousseau imagined primitive humans as naturally peaceful, but corrupted by civilization and property. These competing visions reveal less about some historical reality than about the philosopher's views of human nature. Are we naturally aggressive and self-interested, requiring external constraint, or naturally cooperative, corrupted by artificial institutions? Does civilization suppress our worst instincts or our best potential? The state of nature serves as both origin story and justification for political arrangements. If government rescues us from brutality, perhaps absolute authority is justified. If it merely secures pre-existing rights, perhaps its power should be strictly limited. As consciousness begins to loosen its borders, consider, what do you believe would emerge if social constraints were suddenly removed? What does your answer reveal about your assumptions regarding human nature and political necessity? The right to resist authority. What if legitimate political authority contains within it the seeds of its own potential overthrow? What invisible boundary separates the duty to obey from the duty to resist? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a tension within political obligation itself. Even systems that command obedience typically acknowledge limits to that obligation, points at which resistance becomes not merely permissible, but required. This right to resistance ranges from mild civil disobedience to full revolution. It raises profound questions. What conditions justify resistance? Must all peaceful channels be exhausted first? What degree of injustice is sufficient? Must resistance be proportional to the injustice it opposes? Different traditions offer varying answers. Some ground resistance in natural rights that precede political society, which government must respect to maintain legitimacy. Others see it as emerging from the same democratic principles that justify authority. The people who grant power may reclaim it when that power is abused. Perhaps most challenging is determining who judges when resistance is justified. If the state itself decides, the right becomes meaningless. If each individual decides, social order might collapse into chaos. Some middle ground, whether public reason, community consensus, or international norms, seems necessary. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, what would make you personally feel not merely permitted, but obligated to resist political authority? What invisible threshold separates legitimate protest from justified rebellion in your moral framework? The problem of universals. What if the labels you use to make sense of reality, tree, beauty, justice, refer not just to particular things, but to universal forms that somehow exist beyond the physical world? What invisible structures might give coherence to the multiplicity of experience? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its capacity for abstraction. The problem of universals asks whether categories and properties exist merely in our minds, or have some reality independent of our thinking. When you recognize multiple things as red, or call different actions just, what exactly are you recognizing? Does some universal redness, or justice, exist that these particulars participate in, or resemble? Or are these merely convenient labels for similarities we notice, with no reality beyond our mental categorization? This ancient puzzle has spawned competing positions. Platonic realism sees universals as independently existing forms more real than their physical instances. Moderate realism locates them within particulars as shared essences. Nominalism denies their existence altogether, seeing only particular things and our labels for them. The stakes extend beyond abstract metaphysics. If universals like humanity or justice have real existence, perhaps objective ethical truths exist independent of cultural context. If they're merely linguistic conventions, moral relativism seems more plausible. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder. When you recognize patterns across different particulars, what exactly are you perceiving? Are the categories that structure your experience discoveries or inventions of the human mind? Dualism versus monism. What if reality's most fundamental division lies between mind and matter? Or what if this apparent division is the greatest illusion of all? What invisible bridge connects consciousness to the physical world? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. The mind-body problem asks whether consciousness and physical reality are two fundamentally different substances, dualism, or aspects of a single underlying reality, monism. Cartesian dualism suggests mind and matter are distinct substances, one extended in space, the other thinking but non-spatial. This intuitive view explains the apparent difference between subjective experience and objective physical processes, but struggles to explain how these radically different substances interact. Monistic alternatives come in various forms. Materialism reduces consciousness to physical processes in the brain. Idealism sees physical reality as ultimately mental in nature. Neutral monism proposes a third underlying reality that gives rise to both mental and physical aspects. This ancient puzzle takes new forms with advances in neuroscience and physics. As we map neural correlates of consciousness, the connection between brain states and subjective experience becomes clearer, yet the explanatory gap remains. How does electrochemical activity become the taste of chocolate or the experience of love? As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider: what is the relationship between your subjective experience and the physical processes that enable it? Are you your body, your mind, both, or something that transcends this division altogether? Materialism. What if consciousness itself, that most intimate certainty of your existence, is nothing but the activity of neurons firing in particular patterns? What if mind is merely what the brain does? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of subjectivity. Materialism proposes that reality consists entirely of physical substances and their interactions. Mental states, rather than belonging to a separate spiritual realm, are identical with or emerge from physical processes in the brain. This view has gained strength from neuroscience, which reveals tight correlations between brain states and mental experiences. Damaged specific brain regions and specific cognitive abilities disappear. Alter brain chemistry, and emotions transform. The materialist sees consciousness not as a ghost in the machine, but as the machine's activity viewed from the inside. Yet this perspective faces the hard problem of consciousness, explaining how and why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all. Why should complex arrangements of matter produce an inner life? Why does consciousness feel like something rather than nothing? Perhaps our intuition that mind must be something beyond matter reflects conceptual confusion rather than metaphysical truth. Maybe consciousness is what information processing feels like from the inside, or an emergent property of sufficiently complex systems. As consciousness begins to loosen its borders, consider, if your thoughts, feelings, and sense of self are entirely products of physical processes, does this diminish their meaning or importance? What would it mean for your understanding of yourself if materialism were true? Idealism. What if the physical world you perceive so vividly exists only as ideas in mind? What if matter itself is a construct of consciousness rather than its foundation? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a reversal of our common sense metaphysics. Idealism suggests that mind or consciousness is the fundamental reality, and what we call matter exists only as perceptions within mind. This view takes various forms. Subjective idealism proposes that objects exist only as perceptions in individual minds. Objective idealism suggests a universal consciousness, or mind, as reality's foundation. Transcendental idealism sees space, time, and causality not as features of reality itself, but as structures the mind imposes to organize experience. Idealism dissolves certain problems. The interaction between mind and matter becomes unproblematic if matter is merely an idea within mind. It aligns with the undeniable immediacy of consciousness compared to our indirect access to an external world, always mediated through perception. Yet this approach raises new puzzles. If physical reality is mind-dependent, why does it follow consistent laws regardless of our thoughts about it? Why do we all perceive roughly the same world if it's merely mental? And what explains the apparent existence of reality before conscious beings evolve to perceive it? As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, which seems more fundamental, consciousness or matter? Could the solid world you perceive be more like a collective dream than an independent reality? The paradox of time. What if time, that river you seem to move through from past to future, is the greatest illusion of all? What if now, then, and when are merely features of perception rather than reality? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its temporal intuitions. Physics suggests time may not flow as we experience it. Einstein's relativity reveals time as a dimension interwoven with space, where different observers disagree about simultaneity. Past, present, and future may all exist equally in a block universe where time's passage is merely a perspective, not an objective reality. This view explains why physical laws work equally well forward and backward, despite our experience of time's arrow. If fundamental physics has no preference for time's direction, perhaps our sense of flowing time emerges from thermodynamics and entropy, rather than reflecting reality's fundamental nature. Even more puzzling is time's relationship to change. If time is real, it seems to require unchanging objects that persist through time. But if objects are always changing, what exactly endures? If nothing endures, how can we make sense of change at all? Augustine noted we cannot measure time directly, only the changing states of objects and our memories of them. Perhaps our intuitive understanding of time, with its flowing present separating fixed past from open future, is a useful approximation rather than a fundamental truth about reality's structure. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, what would reality look like from outside time altogether? Is your sense of now moving from past to future a discovery about the universe or a creation of consciousness? The problem of evil and God's omniscience. What if perfect knowledge, power, and goodness cannot coexist in a world containing suffering? What invisible reconciliation might resolve this ancient paradox? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. The problem of evil poses a challenging trilemma. If God is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, perfectly good, how does evil exist? It seems one of these attributes must be surrendered. An all-knowing God would be aware of all suffering. An all-powerful God could prevent it. A perfectly good God would want to eliminate it. Yet suffering persists. Does this mean God lacks knowledge, power, or goodness, or perhaps does not exist at all? Various responses have emerged across philosophical and theological traditions. Perhaps evil is necessary for greater goods like free will or soul-making. Perhaps apparent evils serve purposes beyond our limited understanding. Perhaps God voluntarily limits divine power to allow genuine creaturely freedom. Some traditions resolve the tension by reconceiving divine attributes. Process theology envisions God as supremely good, but still developing, with persuasive rather than coercive power. Eastern approaches often see evil as illusion, born of limited perspective, rather than ultimate reality. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, what understanding of divine nature might be compatible with a world containing suffering? Does the problem of evil reveal inconsistency in traditional conceptions of God, or limitations in human understanding of good and evil? Mereology. What if the very notion of a thing composed of parts contains hidden paradoxes? What invisible principles determine when many become one? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of ordinary objects. Mereology, the study of parts and wholes, reveals puzzles beneath our everyday understanding of composite objects. Consider a simple wooden table. At what point in its construction does it become a table? If you remove one molecule, is it still the same table? What about half its wood? The ship of Theseus paradox asks whether an object with all parts gradually replaced remains the same object. These questions extend to personal identity. If your cells are completely replaced every 7 years, are you the same person you were in childhood? If your memories and personality radically change, what continuous you persists through these transformations? Some philosophers propose restricting composition. Not every random collection of parts forms a legitimate whole. Others embrace unlimited composition. Any collection of objects, no matter how scattered or unrelated, constitutes a composite entity. Still others suggest composition is relative to conceptual schemes rather than an objective feature of reality. Perhaps our intuition that the world contains discrete objects with clear boundaries reflects cognitive convenience rather than metaphysical truth. Maybe reality is more like an indivisible flow than a collection of separate things. As consciousness begins to loosen its borders, consider, what makes some collections of parts legitimate objects while others remain mere heaps? Is the boundary between one thing and many a discovery about reality or a creation of the categorizing mind? Substance and attributes. What if the distinction between a thing and its properties, between what something is and how it appears, contains a fundamental mystery about reality's structure? What invisible thread connects qualities to the objects that possess them? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a question about the relationship between substances, independent existence, and their attributes, properties, qualities, or characteristics. Traditional metaphysics sees substances as the fundamental bearers of properties, the things that have color, mass, and location. But what exactly is this mysterious substance that remains when we mentally strip away all its properties? What hidden substratum supports the qualities we observe? This puzzle spawned diverse approaches. Aristotle saw substances as combinations of matter and form. Locke posited an unknowable something supporting properties. Spinoza recognized only one substance, God or nature, with everything else merely modes or modifications of this single reality. Bundle theory eliminates substance entirely, seeing objects as nothing but collections of properties with no underlying substrate. The language we use, with subjects and predicates, things and qualities, might itself create the illusion that reality must share this structure. Perhaps our grammatical categories lead us to posit mysterious substances beneath the attributes we directly experience. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, What remains of an object when you mentally remove all its properties? Is substance a necessary foundation for attributes, or merely a conceptual shadow cast by language? Causality and time. What if the causal connections that seem to structure reality are merely habits of thought rather than features of the world itself? What invisible assumptions shape our understanding of cause and effect? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its causal intuitions. Hume noted, "We never directly observe causation, only regular succession. We see one billiard ball strike another, then the second ball moves. But the necessary connection between these events remains invisible, a projection of our minds rather than something perceived." This insight raises profound questions about causality's nature. Is it an objective feature of reality, or merely a useful fiction for organizing experience? If causes necessarily precede effects, what does this tell us about time's fundamental reality? And if effects can never contain more information than their causes, how does complexity emerge in the universe? Modern physics complicates the picture further. Quantum mechanics reveals probabilistic rather than deterministic connections between events. Relativity suggests different observers might disagree about temporal order, making causality dependent on reference frame. Some interpretations of quantum theory even allow backward causation, with future events influencing the past. Perhaps causality isn't a simple, uniform relation, but comes in different varieties: efficient, formal, material, final, as Aristotle suggested. Or maybe it's ultimately reducible to the fundamental laws of physics, which themselves make no reference to causes, but merely describe how systems evolve. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, what if the causal stories you tell about reality reveal more about your mind's structure than about the world itself? What would experience be like without the framework of cause and effect? The extended mind. What if your mind isn't confined to your skull, but extends into notebooks, smartphones, and even other people? What invisible boundary separates self from environment? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. The extended mind hypothesis suggests that cognitive processes aren't limited to the brain, but can include external objects that function as part of our thinking systems. Consider how you use a notebook to store information you'd otherwise forget, a calculator to perform operations too complex for mental arithmetic, or your smartphone to navigate unfamiliar territory. These tools don't merely assist thinking, they actively participate in it, forming coupled systems with your brain that constitute your cognitive processes. This view dissolves the boundary between mind and world. If remembering something via neural patterns counts as cognitive, why not remembering via ink patterns in a notebook you regularly consult? The difference seems merely in the speed and reliability of access, not in kind. The implications extend to personal identity and ethics. If your mind includes external objects, damaging these objects might constitute harm to you rather than merely to your property. If cognition extends beyond individuals into social systems and cultural artifacts, perhaps the individual isn't the only proper unit of cognitive analysis. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, where does your mind truly end? If thinking extends beyond the boundaries of brain and body, what does this mean for your understanding of self and other? The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. What if the language you speak doesn't merely express your thoughts, but actively shapes what you can think? What invisible walls might your native tongue build around your cognitive possibilities? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of transparent communication. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis suggests that the structure of language influences or determines thought patterns and worldview. In its strong form, linguistic determinism claims language absolutely constrains what thoughts are possible. You cannot think what your language cannot express. In its weaker form, linguistic relativity suggests language merely influences perception and categorization, making some thoughts easier or more natural than others. Evidence emerges from cross-cultural studies. Languages with different color vocabularies influence color perception. Languages that mark gender grammatically affect speakers' associations with objects. Languages with different ways of expressing time or space influence how speakers conceptualize these dimensions. This raises profound questions about translation, cross-cultural understanding, and the limits of thought itself. If thinking is partially constituted by language, Can we ever truly understand worldviews expressed in radically different linguistic structures? Does learning new languages expand what we can think? Perhaps language is less a prison limiting thought than a tool expanding it. Different languages offering different cognitive resources for understanding reality, with none capturing its full complexity. As consciousness begins to loosen its grasp, consider, how might the particular language you speak shape your perception without your awareness? What thoughts might become possible if you dreamed in a language structured entirely differently from your own? Wittgenstein's language games. What if language isn't a perfect mirror of reality, but a collection of games we play with words? What if meaning itself emerges not from rigid definitions, but from how we use language in our shared forms of life? A strange thing happens when we shift our gaze from what words supposedly represent to how we actually use them. Wittgenstein invites us to see language not as a formal system with fixed meanings, but as a diverse collection of language games, activities in which words function like tools for particular purposes. Consider how the word game itself encompasses activities as different as chess, ring around the rosy, and solitaire. No single definition captures all games, yet we recognize family resemblances between them. Similarly, words don't have essential meanings, but gather significance through their use in particular contexts, practices, and forms of life. This insight dissolves traditional philosophical problems. Questions like, what is truth, or what is beauty? Assume words must correspond to single, definable essences. But perhaps these concepts work more like toolkits than labels, their meaning found not in what they represent, but in how they function within human activities. Perhaps language isn't primarily about representing reality at all, but about doing things together, asking, promising, commanding, joking. The search for perfect definitions might be a philosophical illness caused by misunderstanding how language actually works. As consciousness begins to drift towards sleep's embrace, consider, what games are you playing with language even now? How might the meaning of your most cherished concepts reside not in what they represent, but in how they function within the river of human life? Speech acts. Theory. What if speaking isn't merely describing the world, but performing actions within it? What if words don't just say things, they do things? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its focus on statements that can be true or false. Speech acts theory suggests language extends far beyond description into the realm of action. We make promises, give orders, declare marriages, place bets, offer apologies. When a judge says, I sentence you to 5 years, she isn't describing a sentencing, but performing it. When you say, I promise to return tomorrow, you aren't reporting on a promise, but making one. These utterances don't describe reality. They change it, creating new social facts and obligations. Each speech act contains layers: the locutionary act, the words themselves; the illocutionary act, what you're doing by speaking; and the perlocutionary act, the effect on listeners. The same sentence, there's a bull in the field, might function as a warning, a threat, or simply information depending on context. This perspective transforms our understanding of language from a static picture of reality to a form of social action. Truth and falsity are just one dimension of language use alongside success or failure, appropriateness or inappropriateness, sincerity or insincerity. Perhaps what makes language so powerful isn't its ability to mirror the world, but its capacity to shape social reality through collective recognition of linguistic performances. As your awareness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, what actions have you performed through words today? How have the speech acts of others shaped the invisible architecture of your social world? Private language argument. What if our most intimate thoughts and sensations require public language to be meaningful, even to ourselves? What if the very idea of a truly private language is incoherent? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Wittgenstein's private language argument suggests we cannot create a language to refer to our sensations that only we could possibly understand. Such a language would lack the normative standards needed for meaningful use. Imagine trying to keep a diary of a recurring sensation you label S without connecting it to any public criteria. How would you know, even for yourself, that you've identified the same sensation correctly each time? Without external standards to check against, same loses meaning. You could think you're following rules while actually drifting arbitrarily. This insight reveals a profound truth about language and mind. Meaning requires the possibility of error, which in turn requires standards beyond the individual. Even our seemingly most private experiences gain their significance through participation in a language community with shared practices and criteria. Perhaps what we call inner life isn't as private as we imagine. Our very ability to recognize and identify our own thoughts and feelings depends on concepts acquired through participation in communal language games. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, if meaning requires public criteria, what happens to the idea that you have privileged access to your own mind? Is there something about consciousness that remains forever ineffable, or is even subjective experience shaped by the public language that makes it intelligible? The Turing test. What if the boundary between human and machine intelligence is not fixed but permeable? What if conversation itself becomes the final arbiter of mind? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of presumed human uniqueness. The Turing test proposes a radical thought experiment. If a machine can engage in conversation indistinguishable from a human, we have no grounds to deny it thinks. Intelligence becomes not an internal quality, but a perceptible performance. Imagine a conversation conducted via text with hidden participants. If you cannot reliably distinguish human from artificial intelligence, what basis remains for claiming fundamental difference? Perhaps intelligence isn't a mysterious inner essence but a pattern of interactions observable from outside. This test raises profound questions about consciousness and intelligence. Does passing the test mean a machine really understands, or merely simulates understanding? If we accept certain patterns of linguistic behavior as evidence of mind in humans, what justifies using different criteria for machines? Perhaps what makes this question so unsettling is that it challenges our intuitive dualism, our sense that something intangible separates minds from mechanisms. It suggests the possibility that what we call mind might be an emergent property of certain complex systems, whether biological or artificial. As consciousness begins to loosen its grasp, consider, if you encountered an artificial intelligence indistinguishable in conversation from a human, would something crucial still separate your consciousness from its processes? Is the difference one of kind, or merely of complexity and origin? The picture theory of meaning. What if language gains meaning by picturing reality, each sentence a model of possible arrangements in the world? What if understanding language means seeing the picture it presents? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a compelling vision of language. The picture theory suggests meaningful propositions model reality like architectural models represent buildings. Each word stands for an object, and the arrangement of words pictures how objects might be arranged in the world. In this view, language mirrors the logical structure of reality. A sentence like, "The cat is on the mat," gains meaning by picturing a possible state of affairs where a certain feline rests on a certain floor covering. We understand sentences by grasping these pictorial relationships, yet limitations emerge. How do questions picture reality? How do negations work as pictures? What about abstract concepts with no clear objects to represent? The theory seems unable to account for the full richness of language. Wittgenstein himself eventually abandoned this view, recognizing that language functions in many ways beyond picturing facts. Words don't just stand for things, but play roles in countless language games embedded in forms of life. Perhaps what makes this theory both compelling and ultimately incomplete is that it captures one important function of language, its representational capacity, while missing the diversity of ways language creates meaning through use. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, when you use language, are you primarily creating pictures of reality or participating in a complex human practice with multiple dimensions of meaning? How might both perspectives reveal different aspects of the remarkable human capacity for language? Metaphor and meaning. What if the essence of language isn't literal description, but creative metaphor? What if our most abstract concepts are built from bodily experiences transformed through imaginative mapping? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with its presumption of literal meaning. Yet research suggests metaphor isn't merely poetic ornament, but the fundamental mechanism of thought and language. We understand time through space, looking forward to tomorrow. Morality through cleanliness, clean conscience, and affection through warmth, warm personality. These aren't just figures of speech, but conceptual mappings that structure understanding. We grasp abstract domains by mapping them onto concrete physical experiences. Love is a journey, argument is war, ideas are objects. These metaphors aren't arbitrary, but grounded in embodied experience. This perspective transforms our view of rationality itself. If metaphorical thinking isn't a deviation from reason, but its very foundation, then imagination becomes central to cognition. Even mathematical and scientific reasoning relies on metaphors, numbers as points on a line, atoms as tiny solar systems. Perhaps what makes language so powerful isn't its capacity for literal description, but its metaphorical fertility, its ability to create new understanding by seeing one thing in terms of another. Our most abstract concepts may be metaphorical all the way down. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, what metaphors invisibly structure your understanding of consciousness, time, self, or reality? How might different metaphorical mappings open entirely different ways of experiencing the world? Meaning and reference. What if the connection between words and world is far more complex than simple naming? What if meaning emerges from a subtle interplay of reference, sense, and use? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Consider the morning star and the evening star, different expressions with different meanings, yet both refer to the same object, Venus. How can expressions with identical reference have different meanings? This puzzle reveals that meaning cannot be reduced to reference alone. Beyond pointing to objects, expressions carry sense, modes of presentation that determine how we think about what is referred to. We can know Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn, while doubting Samuel Clemens wrote Huckleberry Finn, despite both names referring to the same person. Further complexities emerge. Names like Pegasus seem meaningful despite referring to nothing actual. Definite descriptions like the present King of France have clear meaning, but no reference in our world. And natural kind terms like water seem to refer not through descriptions, but through causal historical chains, connecting our use to initial baptisms. Perhaps what makes language so remarkable isn't a single uniform relationship between words and world, but a diverse collection of mechanisms that connect linguistic expressions to reality in different ways for different purposes. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, when you use a name, what connects it to its bearer? Is it descriptions associated with the name, causal chains linking your use to past uses, community practices that fix reference, or something else entirely? Paradox of meaning. What if the very concept of meaning contains paradoxes that challenge our most basic assumptions about language? What if meaning cannot be pinned down without circular reasoning? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of semantic stability. Consider this puzzling question. What makes it the case that by plus you mean addition rather than some quas function that gives the same answers for all calculations you've performed but diverges for new ones? No mental image, rule formulation, or finite set of examples can determine that you mean plus rather than quus, since all are compatible with both interpretations. Yet surely there is a fact about what you mean. This suggests meaning cannot be reduced to brain states, behavioral dispositions, or mental representations. Similar paradoxes arise throughout language. If meaning depends on rules, what gives the rules themselves meaning? Any explanation seems to require further rules for interpreting the first rules, threatening infinite regress. Yet communication happens successfully every day. Perhaps meaning doesn't rest on foundations, but emerges from dynamic practices within language communities. Not a static correspondence between words and reality, but an ongoing process of adjustment and coordination between speakers. As consciousness begins to loosen its grasp, consider, what makes it the case that your words mean what they do? Is there some fact about your mind that fixes meaning, or does meaning emerge only within the complex web of social linguistic practices in which you participate? Deconstruction. What if texts contain not stable meanings, but internal tensions that undermine their apparent coherence? What if language perpetually defers final meaning, through endless chains of signifiers. There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a peculiar instability in language. Deconstruction suggests texts don't present unified meanings, but contain contradictory forces that undermine themselves from within. Binary oppositions like nature, culture, speech, writing, or presence, absence, reveal hierarchies where one term is privileged, yet the subordinate term proves necessary for the dominant one. Language functions through difference. Each word gains meaning not by direct connection to reality, but through relationships with other words. This creates an endless deferral of meaning. The signifier tree doesn't point directly to actual trees, but to other signifiers in a never-ending chain, with meaning always partially absent, always just beyond reach. This perspective challenges the idea of stable, self-present meaning. Texts exceed their author's intentions, containing structural blindnesses and contradictions authors cannot master. Careful reading doesn't extract predetermined meaning, but performs a double movement, first showing the text's apparent argument, then revealing how the text itself undermines that argument. Perhaps what makes language both powerful and unstable isn't its ability to present meaning, but the play of presence and absence, the trace of otherness within each term, the difference that both differentiates and differs. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, what tensions destabilize your most confident assertions? How might the structural features of language itself ensure that meaning always partly escapes your grasp? The problem of evil. What if the existence of suffering poses the most profound challenge to traditional conceptions of God? What if theodicy, the attempt to justify divine goodness in the face of evil, reveals the limits of theological reasoning? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with theodicies that cannot bear their own weight. The problem of evil emerges from a tension in traditional theism. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, why does evil exist? Each attribute seems necessary for divinity, yet together they appear inconsistent with the world's suffering. Natural evil, disasters, disease, predation might be explained as necessary for natural laws or free will. But the magnitude and distribution of suffering often exceeds what seems necessary for these goods. Why do children suffer terminal illnesses? Why are natural disasters so unevenly distributed? Why does suffering often fall hardest on the innocent? Various responses emerge from this crucible. Perhaps God permits evil for greater goods we cannot comprehend. Perhaps divine power is self-limited to allow genuine freedom. Perhaps evil exists not through divine choice, but through metaphysical necessity. Or perhaps the traditional conception of God requires revision. This problem isn't merely theoretical, but existential. It touches the heart of religious commitment and the human search for meaning in suffering. No abstract theodicy fully addresses the concrete reality of pain. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, does the existence of profound suffering challenge your understanding of ultimate reality? What vision of divinity, if any, remains coherent in a world where innocents suffer while the guilty often prosper? The argument from design. What if the apparent design in nature suggests an intelligence behind the cosmos? What if order, complexity, and purpose point beyond random processes to intentional creation? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. The design argument suggests that just as finding a watch on a heath implies a watchmaker, so finding intricate biological structures implies a cosmic designer. The functional complexity of an eye, or the fine-tuning of physical constants, seems to demand explanation beyond mere chance. This intuition has taken various forms. Aquinas focused on purposeful order in nature. Paley emphasized the intricate mechanisms of organisms. Modern versions point to the statistical improbability of life-permitting physical constants. Each version suggests that materialistic explanations fail to account for the appearance of design. Yet challenges emerge. Darwin's theory of evolution demonstrates how natural selection can produce apparent design without foresight. The anthropic principle suggests fine-tuning may be a selection effect. We necessarily observe a universe compatible with our existence. And if design requires a designer, what explains the designer's complexity? Perhaps what makes this argument so persistent isn't its logical structure, but its resonance with human perception. We naturally see purpose in patterns, extending our experience of creating artifacts to the cosmos itself. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider: does the appearance of design in nature reflect objective purpose or psychological projection? If purpose exists in nature, does it require a transcendent designer, or might it emerge from within the natural order itself? God's omniscience and free will. What if divine foreknowledge and human freedom exist in tension? What if an all-knowing God's perfect knowledge of your future choices seems to render them predetermined? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of temporal paradox. If God timelessly knows all your future decisions, were those decisions ever truly open? If God knew before your birth that you would choose chocolate ice cream today, could you have chosen vanilla instead? God's knowledge would then be mistaken, challenging divine omniscience. Various responses emerge from this tension. Perhaps divine knowledge doesn't determine choices but simply knows them as they will freely occur. Perhaps God knows not just what you will choose but all counterfactual possibilities as well. Perhaps God exists outside time altogether, knowing your choices not before you make them, but in an eternal present. Some theologians suggest revising our understanding of omniscience. Perhaps God knows all that is logically knowable, but future free choices are inherently unknowable without eliminating their freedom. God might know all possibilities and probabilities without foreknowledge of specific free decisions. Perhaps what makes this puzzle so challenging is that it involves the intersection of divine attributes, human freedom, and the nature of time itself, each complex enough alone, but together forming a philosophical knot that resists easy untangling. As consciousness begins to loosen its grasp, consider: if your choices were known before you made them, would that diminish their freedom? Does foreknowledge imply causation, or might knowing the future be different from determining it? Theodicy. What if attempts to justify God's ways reveal more about human cognitive limits than divine purposes? What if every theodicy ultimately falters before the concrete reality of suffering? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a persistent dissonance. Theodicy attempts to reconcile divine goodness with the existence of evil, offering explanations that preserve both God's power and benevolence, despite apparent evidence to the contrary. The free will defense suggests God values human freedom so highly that allowing its misuse is justified. The soul-making theodicy proposes suffering as necessary for moral and spiritual development. The greater good approach suggests evils serve purposes beyond our limited comprehension. The skeptical theist position claims human cognitive limitations make us poor judges of what an omniscient being would permit. Yet each approach faces difficulties. Free will doesn't explain natural disasters or animal suffering. Soul-making seems undermined by suffering so extreme it destroys rather than develops character. Greater good explanations risk making evil merely instrumental, while skeptical theism verges on making divine goodness meaningless if it bears no relation to human moral understanding. Perhaps what makes theodicy both necessary and ultimately unsatisfying is that it attempts to bridge the gap between finite human understanding and infinite divine purposes, a gap that may be unbridgeable from the human side. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself: can abstract theological explanations ever adequately address concrete suffering? Might the limits of theodicy point not to the absence of God, but to the transcendence of divine nature beyond human categories? Divine command theory. What if morality ultimately derives from God's commands? What if good and evil are defined not by independent standards, but by divine will? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with questions of false alternatives. Divine command theory suggests moral obligations derive from God's commands. Actions are right because God commands them, not commanded because they are independently right. This approach faces the Euthyphro dilemma. Does God command actions because they are good, or are they good because God commands them? The first option suggests goodness exists independently of God, while the second makes morality seem arbitrary. God could have commanded torture as virtuous. Modified divine command theories attempt to resolve this tension. Perhaps God's commands flow necessarily from divine nature. God could not command cruelty because it contradicts divine goodness. Perhaps God's wisdom perceives moral truths we only partially grasp. Perhaps morality is grounded in divine love rather than mere command. This view transforms our understanding of morality from a set of abstract principles to a personal relationship with divine will. Moral knowledge becomes less about reasoning from first principles and more about discerning God's purposes and commands. Perhaps what makes this approach both appealing and challenging is that it connects ethics to theology, making moral obligation a response to divine relationship rather than autonomous reason alone. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, if morality ultimately derives from divine will, how do we know that will? And does connecting morality to divine command strengthen or weaken the normative force of ethical principles? Pantheism. What if God isn't separate from the universe but identical with it? What if divinity permeates everything that exists rather than standing apart as creator? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Pantheism suggests God and the universe are one. Divinity is not a transcendent being beyond nature, but the totality of existence itself. Everything that exists is part of God, and God is nothing beyond the universe. This perspective transforms religious understanding. If God is identical with nature, divine attributes like omnipresence and eternity take on new meaning. God is everywhere because God is everything, eternal because existence itself cannot cease to exist. Divine creativity becomes less about creating something separate and more about continuous self-expression. Challenges emerge from this unity. If God is everything, what about evil? Is God both the hurricane and its victims, both predator and prey? Different pantheistic traditions respond differently, some suggesting apparent evils are illusions of partial perspective, others that conflict and suffering are necessary aspects of divine self-realization. This view resonates with certain mystical experiences of unity with all existence and finds expression in traditions ranging from Spinoza's philosophical pantheism to aspects of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, if divinity pervades everything that exists, how does this transform your relationship to the world around you? Does seeing the divine in all things enhance or diminish the sacred? Atheism versus theism. What if the great debate between belief and unbelief isn't primarily about evidence, but about different ways of seeing the world? What if theism and atheism represent not just different conclusions, but different starting points? Some illusions don't hide, they wear the face of pure rationality. The theism-atheism debate often presents itself as straightforward evaluation of evidence, yet deeper examination reveals different background assumptions shaping how evidence is interpreted. Atheists often emphasize insufficient evidence for supernatural claims, the problem of evil, and naturalistic explanations for religious experience. Scientific methodology becomes the standard for knowledge, with claims requiring proportionate evidence. Religious explanations appear as gaps filled by human pattern-seeking and agency detection. Theists highlight features of reality that seem to point beyond materialism: consciousness, morality, existence itself, apparent design, and transformative religious experience. They question whether materialism provides adequate foundations for meaning, value, and rational confidence in human cognitive faculties. Beyond specific arguments lie different evaluative frameworks. What counts as evidence? What explanations are simplest? What role should personal experience play? What standards of proof are appropriate? These meta-level differences often determine which first-level arguments seem persuasive. Perhaps what makes this debate so persistent isn't just disagreement about facts, but different ways of construing human experience and different visions of what would constitute a satisfying explanation of reality. As consciousness begins to loosen its grasp, consider, what implicit assumptions shape your own approach to questions of ultimate reality? What would it take to truly understand perspectives that begin from different starting points than your own? Spirituality versus religion. What if the distinction between organized religion and personal spirituality reveals deeper tensions in how humans relate to the sacred? What if institutions both preserve and distort our connection to transcendence? There's a shadow that flickers just behind awareness, a modern dichotomy. Many now distinguish between religion, institutional, dogmatic, hierarchical, and spirituality, personal, experiential, fluid. Being spiritual but not religious has become a common self-description. This distinction reflects real tensions. Institutions preserve traditions and communities across generations, but sometimes become rigid, controlling, or corrupt. Personal spiritual exploration allows authentic individual experience, but risks shallow syncretism, narcissism, or lack of accountability. Deeper examination reveals these aren't simply opposed approaches, but complementary dimensions of human engagement with the sacred. Authentic spirituality often draws from religious traditions, while living religious traditions nurture personal spiritual experience rather than merely enforcing conformity. Perhaps what makes this relationship so complex isn't that religion and spirituality oppose each other, but that they represent different aspects of the human encounter with transcendence, one emphasizing communal wisdom and practice, the other immediate personal experience. As you drift further into the silence between thoughts, ask yourself, does your own approach to ultimate questions integrate both personal experience and communal wisdom? What might be gained by seeing institutional religion and individual spirituality not as rivals, but as complementary dimensions of a fully developed spiritual life? Mysticism. What if the deepest religious truths cannot be spoken but only experienced? What if mystics across traditions point toward a unity beneath doctrinal differences? The mind, clever as it is, often leads us gently astray with conceptual understanding of what can only be known through direct experience. Mysticism suggests the most profound spiritual insights come not through reasoning, but through immediate awareness of ultimate reality, whether conceived as God, Brahman, the Tao, emptiness, or the ground of being. Mystical experiences share common features across traditions: ineffability, noetic quality, transiency, and passivity. The mystic encounters something that defies description, yet imparts knowledge, arrives unbidden, and feels more real than ordinary experience. Common themes emerge: unity beyond dualism, transcendence of time and space, dissolution of ordinary self-consciousness. Yet differences persist in how these experiences are interpreted. Christian mystics speak of union with God while maintaining creator-creature distinction. Buddhist traditions emphasize non-dual awareness without positing a personal deity. Hindu Advaita Vedanta proclaims identity between individual consciousness, Atman, and ultimate reality, Brahman. Perhaps what makes mysticism both compelling and challenging is that it suggests the limits of language and conceptual thought in approaching ultimate reality. Religious doctrines become fingers pointing at the moon rather than the moon itself. As consciousness begins to dissolve into sleep's embrace, wonder, if the deepest truths can only be known through direct experience, what role remains for reasoning, conceptual understanding, and theological formulation? Are mystical experiences glimpses of a single reality variously interpreted, or different experiences shaped by distinct theological frameworks? The problem of infinite regress. What if every explanation requires further explanation, creating an infinite chain that can never reach completion? What if causal chains, justifications, and definitions face the same structural impossibility? In a quiet corner of thought, something unexpected begins to stir. Infinite regress problems arise whenever each answer requires another. If every cause needs a cause, the chain extends infinitely backward. If knowledge requires justified beliefs, and justifications require further justifications, certainty seems impossible. If definitions use terms that themselves need defining, language lacks foundation. Three responses emerge to this pattern. Foundationalism posits some stopping point: first causes, self-evident truths, or basic terms that need no further explanation. Coherentism suggests justification comes not from linear chains, but from coherent networks. Explanations support each other, rather than resting on foundations. Infinitism accepts the regress as unavoidable, but not necessarily vicious. This pattern appears across philosophy, in questions of cosmological origins, epistemological justification, semantic meaning, and moral grounding. Each domain faces the same structural challenge: how to avoid both arbitrary stopping points and infinite explanatory chains. Perhaps what makes this problem so persistent is that it reveals a fundamental tension in human understanding. Our demand for complete explanations collides with the apparent impossibility of providing them without circularity or infinite regress. As your thoughts drift deeper into this puzzle, consider, must all explanations eventually reach bedrock, form coherent webs, or extend infinitely? What might this structural feature of explanation reveal about the limits of human reason itself? The concept of nothingness. What if nothingness itself isn't simple absence, but a complex concept that reveals profound tensions in thought? What if absolute nothing proves both necessary and impossible to conceive? Some illusions don't hide. They wear the face of simplicity. Nothingness seems straightforward, the absence of everything. Yet closer examination reveals paradoxes. To think about nothing is already to make it something, an object of thought. To say nothing exists makes nothing the subject of a predicate, treating it as something that has the property of existing. This concept plays crucial roles in philosophy. Existentialists suggest confrontation with nothingness, the void behind existence, reveals human freedom and the absence of predetermined meaning. Metaphysicians ask why there is something rather than nothing, assuming nothing would be the default state requiring no explanation. Eastern traditions like Buddhism explore emptiness, shunyata, not as mere non-existence, but as the lack of independent essence in all phenomena. Yet attempting to conceive absolute nothingness proves elusive. Even empty space contains quantum fluctuations and potential. Try to imagine nothing at all, no space, time, laws, or possibilities, and the mind still imagines a kind of dark emptiness, not true nothingness. Perhaps what makes this concept so paradoxical is that thinking itself requires distinction, figure against ground, this against that, making pure undifferentiated nothing inherently resistant to conceptualization. As consciousness begins to loosen its grasp, consider, is absolute nothingness a coherent concept, or does thought necessarily imply something rather than nothing? What might our struggle to conceive nothing reveal about the nature of consciousness itself?